Good afternoon, everyone. I'm so excited to be here. Good afternoon. My name is Rosanna Torres Pizarro, and I have the incredible honor of leading the Center for a New Economy, Puerto Rico's not only leading but first think tank. I'd like to take a moment to thank everyone at the Tobin Center. I'm not going to say out names because I may miss one, and everybody here has just been so fabulous to work with, so thank you so much for hosting us here. It's been great to get a little bit of reprieve from the Puerto Rico heat and be in this like amazing fall weather, so thank you so much for hosting us here. Before we get into it, want to lay out a couple of ground rules. Silence your phones, please. Not only do they interrupt our train of thought for the panelists that we'll have here today, but this will also be recorded, and so don't want the ringtones in the future recording. Because we do have a lot of ground to cover, you'll notice in the agenda there are no specific breaks. We will add one at the beginning, the end of the first panel. But please note, bathrooms are limited. And so if you do need a restroom, coffee break, feel free to also get up on your own. And the bathrooms are around the corner, should have mentioned that. And so with that, I wanna thank you for dedicating not just a Friday, but a Friday afternoon of a long weekend to talk about the economy, about Puerto Rico's economy. At the Center for a New Economy at CNE, this is what we do on a daily basis. So we love to talk about Puerto Rico's economy, but we realize that on a Friday before a long weekend, this is quite the honor of having you join us. Just a little bit about what we do. We study, we design, and we advocate for sound public policy for Puerto Rico. We are an independent, nonpartisan organization that focuses solely, our main mission is to provide real and lasting solutions for Puerto Rico's many and complex challenges. That vision has guided us for the past 26 years, and it's what keeps us moving forward with our heads held high and very optimistic about the future. We decided to host this event here today to commemorate a time where research was very much valued and ideas and the insights from academia and from think tanks like ours were fundamental to shaping public policy. And we can't lose sight of that. So this is a reminder of how important that collaboration is. Though from many angles, it may seem that our discourse is at an impasse. I mean, we are quite literally in the middle of a government shutdown. I say that we really can't fix anything by standing in the sidelines. The only way to break a stalemate is by injecting sound policy into our discussions, by developing reliable, impartial information that policymakers can use to make those informed decisions. So that's our mission. That's the mission of think tanks generally. We work to responsibly inform and influence that policymaking process. And then eventually also translating all of that very complex information into simple messages that the general public can use to advocate, but also to share with their family and friends, and then eventually create even more pressure around political circles so that those policies do get enacted. I think generally now that with the rise of AI and just how fast-paced our world is, we are living in a world of very quick fixes, and in that same environment, we choose to go in a very opposite direction, and it's to choose rigor, persistence, and an unwavering commitment to public good. And so why are we here today? You may have seen in the invitation, and you will hear from our panelists today about the events of 1974 that forced Puerto Rico to take a hard look at its economic strategy of the time. And here we are today, 50 years later, we're in a very similar inflection point. In fact, if you read back into the Tobin Report, there are a lot of similarities of what we are living today and what we were living back then. So in order to look at the future, I think it's also very important to revisit our past, and not necessarily to follow every prescription blindly. It's to get insights, to really understand what we could have done then that we could still apply now, what makes sense. If we really are truly going to transform Puerto Rico's economy. And so I want to invite you to think of something different. I want you to picture this. And I think, first of all, we would need a setting change. You're in Puerto Rico, so it's a little warmer than what it is here. The day starts with a cafecito, none of that, like, let's go to Starbucks. And it starts with the daily edition of El Nuevo Dia. And the front page announces 5,000 more jobs added this month. Puerto Rico has been a leading pioneer of energy innovation. A family from Hormigueros started with a $5,000 investment in an old factory, and now they are the leading exporters of recycled seaweed products in the Caribbean. And I recognize that if we read the news today, I heard a couple of chuckles, that may seem somewhat optimistic, delusional maybe, but I am asking you to choose to see things not as they are, but as they could be. And I have no doubt that if we put in all of our effort, Puerto Rico's economy could really be transformed. We really could be recycling seaweed to making cosmetics or any other article. I think that is what makes humans that drive do great things. And so that's what I think we need to be focused on. Of course, that road won't be easy. The world has changed quite dramatically, but that hasn't ever stopped our imagination before. I'm particularly excited because the energy that you feel in conferences, I like to describe it as like a collective effervescence. It really does inspire folks, and I invite you to not let go of that effervescence, keep it bubbling up, because we do have to unite in this together. This is not something that will come from a single organization. There's not a single idea that should be singled out. We do have to collectively unite forces. And of course, designing collaborative processes is never easy. I think when you bring many voices to the table, conflict is pretty much inevitable, but that doesn't mean failure. In my own experience, working throughout government, acknowledging that tension as part of the process helps manage expectations. What matters is having a structure where that room for disagreement is good. We can channel that energy productively. And that the focus is on the shared goals. So instead of agreeing to disagree, I think that we need to shift to where we can agree to agree. And if there's one thing that we can all agree on with the late, great economist James Tobin, is that any path forward requires a disciplined strategy. It means, 1, analyzing the current landscape, 2, identifying real opportunities for economic expansion, 3, revisiting core issues like fiscal discipline, and 4, crafting a structured roadmap for long-term growth. We come into this conversation in the only way that we know how, and that's strategically. Through this conference, we begin by integrating our knowledge and our expertise of Puerto Rico's economic history. And as we continue these conversations, we'll also revisit our past proposals on fiscal discipline. We had shared a report back in 2015, when Promesa was first being discussed around fiscal responsibility laws. We should take those back. And we also need to identify essential elements without which economic transformation will remain elusive. We will uncover a methodology that will help us draw a good roadmap for the future, called economic complexity. And finally, we'll close any financial gaps with our proposal for an economic development trust that invests in our future. So I invite you to subscribe into our newsletter and make sure that you don't lose out on those following steps that we'll be pursuing. Many of those next steps will happen in collaboration with many stakeholders, some of which are here today, officials from both sides of political parties in Puerto Rico, economists from different disciplines, and private sector leaders. Without hesitation, every one of the speakers that you'll hear from today said yes from the get-go, and I think that's also, one, it speaks to our convening power, but two, it also means that there is a shared spirit of getting this right, of transforming Puerto Rico's economy. And so with that, I want to go ahead and get started. Want to introduce our first guest that will be joining us more virtually due to government shutdown. But the Honorable Pablo José Hernández is Puerto Rico's youngest ever resident commissioner and was elected in 2024 with the highest vote count of any official. He represents the island in the U.S. Congress, focusing on economic development, equity in federal programs, and infrastructure rebuilding. A graduate of Stanford Law School, he previously worked in the governor's office in Puerto Rico, clerked for Judge Gustavo Helpi at the U.S. Court of Appeals for the First Circuit, and held roles in both legal practice and tech policy in Washington, D.C. He is the author of several books around Puerto Rico's history and political status. And if you can join me in looking at the monitors for a message from him.
Distinguished members of the CNE, Yale University, and the Puerto Rican community, I regret that I wasn't able to join you in person today. I looked forward to speaking at this event commemorating the 50th anniversary of the Tobin Report. Unfortunately, the government shutdown disrupted my ability to do so. Nevertheless, I wanted to share a few reflections as you gather to discuss the past, present, and future of Puerto Rico's economy through the lens of the Tobin Report. And I'd like to focus on leadership and how the Tobin Report offers timeless lessons on what effective leadership looks like in difficult times. Lesson 1, surround yourself with experts. We live in an age where too many politicians wage war against academia, intellectuals, and expertise. It was not always that way. True intelligence is not knowing everything, it's knowing that there is much you don't know. In 1974, Governor Rafael Hernández Colón showed that kind of intelligence. He turned to one of the world's leading economists, Professor James Tobin, to help Puerto Rico navigate its fiscal crisis. The committee Tobin led embodied the belief that good policy begins with good knowledge. Lesson 2, have the courage to make tough decisions. The Tobin's report recommendations were politically toxic. Reduce government spending, stop pay increases, raise taxes, even limit certain labor benefits. At the time, the newspaper El Mundo warned that accepting these recommendations would not help the governor politically. Yet he didn't hide from them. He faced the public and said, quote, "We must make grave decisions that will affect everyone." And he did. Among his measures was a special tax famously nicknamed La Vampirita, the little vampire, because it seemed to suck money straight from people's pockets. But neither Tobin nor Hernández Colón let grim numbers extinguish their hope. And here comes lesson 3. Be realistic, but also be optimistic. As journalist A.W. Maldonado wrote at the time, quote, "The report is essentially optimistic. Tobin and his committee believe Puerto Rico can emerge from this crisis." That belief was powerful, especially for those who feared it was already too late. Decades later, Hernández Colón revisited those lessons. In a 2009 column written after the government laid off 16,000 employees, he reflected that, quote, "We were headed for this moment of truth a long time ago." He described how the island recovered in the 1970s and 80s after implementing Tobin's recommendations, but later faltered when leaders overcommitted resources and abandoned fiscal discipline in the 90s and early 2000s. Yet even in that difficult moment, he ended with hope. He wrote, "The painful experience we are undergoing could yield a fruitful lesson that would take our politics to another level." When I reread his words ahead of this gathering, I first thought his hope had not materialized. It's been 16 years. Then I realized it's not necessarily a question of if, but when. At 34, I belong to the generation that came of age amid austerity, not abundance. a generation that has seen too many short-term bets and long-term suffering. I regret not being with you today, but I deeply appreciate your effort to learn from the Tobin experience, and I look forward to working together to bridge academia, civil society, and the public sector in pursuit of a brighter future for Puerto Rico's economy. Thank you.
As he mentioned, he's unable to join us today for the government shutdown. Yes, round of applause. And so with that, with his message, thank him for the time that he took to craft this message. But let's go right along with live human beings we have here with us today. It is my pleasure to introduce Richard Levin, the Frederick William Beinecke Professor of Economics and Director of the Project on U.S.-China Relations at Yale University. He served as Yale's 22nd president from 1993 to 2013, a period of major investment, international expansion, and partnership with the city of New Haven. Nationally, he advised President Obama on science and technology policy and co-chaired a National Academy of Sciences review that helped shape the America Invents Act. Please welcome to the stage, Rick Levin.
Well, good afternoon, everyone. I'm here to tell you a little bit about the person who you are remembering today, who was behind the Tobin Report. I was a student and a colleague of Jim Tobin for 32 years, from the time I came to graduate school here at Yale in 1970 until his death in 2002. For me, as for hundreds of students and colleagues, Jim Tobin was a model and an inspiration. As a teacher, scholar, departmental colleague, citizen of the university, and shaper of public policy, his influence derived from two sources: his crystal clear intelligence and his moral seriousness. These two aspects of Jim's nature corresponded exactly to the reasons he decided to take up economics as a profession in the late 1930s. In his own words, economic theory was a fascinating intellectual challenge and with obvious relevance to understanding and perhaps overcoming the Great Depression and all the frightening political developments associated with it throughout the world. As a teacher and colleague, Jim conveyed with every ounce of his being these two lessons. Economics was rigorous and beautiful, and it mattered. In my first year of graduate school, Jim played only a cameo role in our required economic theory course, entering to deliver just a few lectures on each of two unrelated topics: externalities and the life cycle model of consumption and savings. I can testify for sure that there was nothing theatrical about Jim's classroom style. He was not a charismatic or dynamic lecturer. Still, I remember his classes on these two subjects as if he gave them yesterday. We were terrified novices in his presence, but he nonetheless began every class as Socrates, posing questions as if he expected us to have the answers. Miraculously, he would turn every wandering answer toward true north as he moved from being questioner to lecturer. He was so clear, so coherent, so perfect, that one understood not only the particular models he explicated and their limitations, but how one might ask and answer a large family of questions in the same conceptual neighborhood. It seems astonishing to say this, but in two classes on the life cycle model, I believe Jim gave us all we needed to understand every argument that has been offered in the past 50 years of debate on funding the Social Security system. As a colleague and sometimes departmental chair, Jim set the tone for us all. His passion for both the beauty and relevance of economics inspired and motivated nearly all the junior faculty of my generation and those that preceded it. Even for those of us working at some distance from Jim's principal areas of interest, he was our intellectual hero. Though none of us traveled so far, we all followed in his path. Jim also taught us how to be citizens of this university, any university. I was fortunate early in my career to serve on a committee that came to bear his name, charged in 1980 with reconsidering all aspects and procedures, all aspects of the procedures and criteria for appointing and promoting faculty. For Jim, such a task required the same high level of intellectual rigor and moral seriousness as any work of scholarship. The Tobin Report, as this report was called here at Yale, not your Tobin Report, but another Tobin Report, was more than a set of recommendations. It is a wise and learned treatise on how a great university develops its faculty, how it should fairly balance such competing considerations as demonstrated scholarly achievement, potential future scholarship, teaching, and citizenship. The report is as clear and logical as any Tobin article or lecture. For me, however, the enduring significance of the Tobin Committee was not the content of its report, but its method of work. I learned, and it served me well later as president, that if a question is worth asking, it's worth bringing to bear the full powers of one's intellect and the full range of one's moral sensibility. The concern for the welfare of ordinary people that led Jim to become an economist permeated his thinking about the world. Many of his conceptual innovations, the negative income tax and the measure of economic welfare, for example, were motivated by his desire to improve the well-being of citizens, and particularly the least fortunate. He was proud of his years of service on the Council of Economic Advisors during President Kennedy's administration. He was especially proud of laying the foundation for what became major tax legislation after he left, and of encouraging the Federal Reserve to stimulate investment by embarking upon Operation Twist, as it was then called, a technique rediscovered a half-century later by Ben Bernanke in response to the great financial crisis. I was not involved at all with Jim's work on Puerto Rico, but I am aware that it was controversial. However austere his recommendations may have seemed at the time, I'm confident that his intentions were for Puerto Rico to flourish and for all citizens to share in its growth. Jim's passion for creative policy design never ceased. For decades, in our daily gatherings for morning coffee next door here at the Coles Foundation, Jim kept us abreast of his thinking on economic policy issues of the day. There was plenty of debate among the regulars at coffee, Bill Brainerd, Bill Nordhaus, Ray Fair, Martin Shubik, and Herb Scarf, among others. But Jim would almost always, by rigorous analysis, win the argument. Jim Tobin was in a class by himself, possessing virtues rarely combined in the same person. He was a towering scholar and a moral hero. I'm delighted that you've all gathered here to remember his work. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Rick. That was an excellent insight into Jim himself. So thank you so much for sharing that with us. Our next panel takes us back to a pivotal moment in Puerto Rico's economic history. In the mid-1970s, facing mounting fiscal pressures and the limits of its development model, Governor Rafael Hernández Colón commissioned an independent economic assessment from Nobel laureate and Yale professor James Tobin, along with a team of distinguished economists. Their 1975 report offered a candid look at Puerto Rico's structural challenges, warning against over-reliance on external investment and federal aid. It also set a powerful precedent, one where evidence-based research and honest analysis helped guide policy during a time of great uncertainty. Today, 3 distinguished economists will revisit that landmark report, its historical context, its key findings, and most importantly, the lessons that it still holds for Puerto Rico today. Stephen Barry is the Sterling Professor of Economics at Yale University and the inaugural faculty director of the Tobin Center for Economic Policy. His research focuses on competition, markets, and economic policy, with influential studies spanning industries from automobiles to airlines. He is a fellow of the Econometric Society and winner of its prestigious Frisch Medal. Heidie Calero is an economist and attorney with decades of experience in economic consulting, finance, and policy analysis. She is the founder and president of H. Calero Consulting Group, one of Puerto Rico's economic consulting firms. And over the years, she has advised clients across sectors, from infrastructure and real estate to healthcare and manufacturing. She has also published 2 books on Puerto Rico's economy. She was part of the finance team of Governor Hernández Colón's finance team when he commissioned the Tobin Report. And finally, Sergio Marxuach is policy director and general counsel at the Center for a New Economy. He has extensive experience in both government and the private sector, and his work on Puerto Rico's fiscal and economic issues has been featured in many international outlets and pretty much on a daily basis in Puerto Rico's news. Please join me in welcoming to the stage here Professor Stephen Barry, Heidie Calero, and Sergio Marxuach.
Maybe I'll say, we're going to have a little bit of mostly a conversation. Thank you. Excellent. We're mostly going to have a conversation here. Heidie's going to start with a few slides of background, and I may turn to Sergio to give us a little further background as well. We're going to just try to have a little conversation up here. I should say that I am expert on exactly none of the topics that we are discussing today. I am an economist, so when I ask a question, it's sincere. I actually want to hear the answer to that question. So we'll have a little discussion up here, and then at the end, I think we'll turn it over to some questions from you. We might collect a few and answer them, and also get a little conversation going back and forth between those of us at the front of the room and those of us up here. But we are going to start, I think, with some probably necessary background, a little scene setting from Heidie. So
that's right.
Yeah.
Good afternoon, everybody. Thank you for having me for this invite, which is really exceptional, at least for me. And it's so nice to see so many young faces, also garnered with some not so young, but at least charged with years. So I cannot say it's a Holocaust survivor, but I was a survivor because I did work on the, at this time I was with the Office of Management and Budget. I had just returned from my graduate studies in the University of York in England, so it was a fascinating time to see economics at work. So what I'm going to do with these slides is just to give you a taste, so as to set up the background for what seems to be, I hope it's an interactive conversation. So Rafael Hernández Colón was a new governor. He was 36 years old, so quite young to be, and at a time when it was very, very convulsive. And what we had was the Arabs discovered the black gold, which was the oil. And what happened in 1973 was this first oil shock in our modern economy. You see there the prices, how they went up. They paled to what later on have been the $1 per barrel. But at least in the 1950s and 70s, it was sort of stable at $2.57 a barrel. And then it just shot up to 100% in 1973. And then the second oil shock back in 81, 82, and 83 to almost $36 a barrel. Real growth at the time in that economy. Notice this red line that you see there, that's Puerto Rico's real GNP growth, taking inflation out. But you notice that it was far higher than the blue line, which is the real GNP growth of the US, also in our fiscal year. So Puerto Rico's was really growing at a clip of 8, 9%. It was the golden years of the 1960s. Hey, then what happened with the first oil shock was this decline in the economy. And from 1974 to 1983, Puerto Rico's average real growth was 1.3%, whereas the US was still higher, 2.2%. That was not what was happening in the 1960s, where Puerto Rico's growth was really a young economy and much higher growth than the US. And notice that yellow line that you see there, that average public debt was $6.4 billion. Wow. Times have changed, huh? Then James Tobin was retained by Governor Hernández Colón because he was concerned about all the things that were happening in this economy. As I said, he was a young governor and faced with these economic and financial challenges, and he was very concerned about making a legacy. And so he retained James Tobin and a very distinguished group of economists. And these were some of the recommendations, which you may agree or not agree, but at the time they were really oriented towards policies that the government of Puerto Rico was to implement. So they limit government expenses and pay increases to increase tax revenues, develop operating surpluses in public corporations, limit growth of public debt below GNP growth, adopt measures to train and employ youths, generate restraint on wages, incentivate investment and jobs by tax-exempt firms, and then the final one, create jobs through investment by private industry. These were the recommendations at a very high level that I am presenting here. Let's see what happened. Were they followed? Were they not followed? What events have followed? Well, now let's go quickly to 2005 through 2025, which is the current fiscal year that just finished in Puerto Rico in July. So it's July 1st through June 30th. That's our fiscal year. So Puerto Rico during this period was growing, or rather not growing, at a clip of negative 0.7%, and the US was growing at a 2.1%. And notice that yellow line. That's the public debt. Did Puerto Rico follow the recommendations of James Tobin? Of course not. Public debt was really skyrocketing, and it was not followed for a period, yes, of time. But after 2001, all hell broke loose. Then we have the other important thing that was taking place in Puerto Rico is this growing gap between gross domestic product and gross national product. For the US, it doesn't make that much difference, but for us, it does make a difference because most of the capital in manufacturing, it's US companies, and so those profits are included in the gross domestic product, but not in the GNP. And so what stays in Puerto Rico is that magenta line, and notice that the yellow is the gap size as it went on increasing, and that's one of the things that James Tobin warned in terms of the strategy that Puerto Rico is following. And then these real growth rates of Puerto Rico exports and US GNP before that yellow vertical line that you see there, Puerto Rico exports was the orange line and the US GNP was the blue line, and they sort of moved in tandem. But notice what happened after 1988, 89, through the present. It's all volatile. So there is this deindustrialization of Puerto Rico, not followed by really a very oriented economic strategy. And that's one of the things that lessons that we have learned. Then Puerto Rico has lagged the US and other countries for the past 20 years, Puerto Rico being the magenta line, golden years up to mid-70s. That's when the first recession started. And all the other countries have really, as a percentage of the US, they have improved, but not Puerto Rico. Moody's bond classifications Governor Hernández Colón, as well as Casellas and the Government Development Bank, they were all very concerned about protecting Puerto Rico's credit. And so when this happened was that the GOs, they lost investment grade, and we were now junk. We still are. Now, 2016 to the present, only to summarize, is Puerto Rico doesn't have the money. Puerto Rico declares bankruptcy at last. That was in June 2015. Governor Padilla declared Puerto Rico cannot pay its public debt. And then we have now a fiscal management oversight board ruled by Congress. That was in 2016. To this day, they are the ones who are dealing with the public debt of Puerto Rico, renegotiating it. So we have the Puerto Rico problem. But I think the biggest challenge, and with that I close, is vision. That's the challenge that Tobin warned us against. I think that was the concern that Governor Hernández Colón and other governors have also had. But we still face that challenge, and that is going to really persecute us for many, many years to come. Thank you.
Thanks, Heidie. So, Sergio, we've heard a bit about the problems facing Puerto Rico particularly, but maybe you could elaborate for us a little bit about the sort of broader macroeconomic context in the world and why these are in fact difficult problems and difficult problems at the time?
Yes. Thank you very much for the opportunity, and thank you for all of you being here. I just want to mention 2 points that I think very important. Number one, we all kind of forget, right? The international system that we lived in until fairly recently was designed after 1945, after the Second World War. There were a set of coordinated agreements between both at the international level. There was the creation of several institutions: the IMF, the World Bank, the United Nations, the GATT, which eventually became the WTO. And the world was essentially recuperating from this massive shock, right? The Second World War was completely deglobalized. There was very little capital, people flows, trade was very limited. So Puerto Rico comes up in that era and moves away from what it was initially a state-led industrialization. The government of Puerto Rico actually owned 5 or 6 factories, which they sold towards the end of the 1940s, and then implemented what eventually came known as an export-led development strategy, as opposed to an import substitution strategy, which many other countries decided to follow. And the reason they decided to go with the export-led model was because we being Puerto Rico, we had an excess, we had what was called then surplus labor in the agricultural sector of the economy, which was being underemployed or not employed at all. The idea was to move that surplus to what was called in the model the modern sector of the economy, which was basically manufacturing, light manufacturing, textiles, things like that. As that amount of labor moved from the less productive agricultural sector to the more modern, more productive manufacturing sector, the economy will grow, wages will rise, quality of living, standard of living will rise. And that essentially pretty much worked for 30 years. And I there are some caveats. It was not perfect. There were still high unemployment levels, partly because we were losing more jobs in the agricultural sector faster than we were creating new jobs in the new manufacturing sector. So poverty rates, unemployment rates were still relatively high. Quality of living did increase significantly, though, for the average citizen in Puerto Rico, as measured by most standards, including, schooling attainment, life expectancy, physicians per 100,000 people, all the standard human development indicators show significant improvement between 1945 and 1975. That's where we come to this inflection point, not only in Puerto Rico's history, but I think really in global economic history. The whole Bretton Woods agreement was being challenged since the late 60s. It was interesting doing research for this. You come across phrases that were used by Valéry Giscard. It's like the U.S. had this exorbitant privilege, right, of being the world reserve currency, the Triffin dilemma about, how the U.S. faced this dilemma of providing world currency, but at the same time, in order to do that, you had to run a balance of payment deficit, which will eventually undermine the stability of your own currency. Nixon takes away convertibility for gold from the dollar in 1971. So we were already facing a whole bunch of problems at the global level. And then you have the Yom Kippur War, as Heidie mentioned, which basically tripled oil prices. And then it was a real aha moment for the entire world. Basically, the entire field of macroeconomics had been developing since 1930s to deal with deflation, with shocks to the demand side of the equation, not necessarily looking at the supply side. And here we had, for the first time, this massive inflation coupled with high unemployment, which, according to some theories, was technically impossible, or at least highly unlikely, let's put it that way. But it did happen nonetheless, right? And it took the whole discipline of economics by surprise. I remember taking classes here with Professor Norhaus, and he still talked about it in the 90s. It's like we really had a tough time dealing with this combination because traditional economic tools would essentially make inflation worse by stoking demand. So it's in that environment, which I think it's a very difficult environment, and we have to have a little bit of grace with the people who are dealing with this situation. It was until then unseen, right? At least in the Western world, and it is in that environment that Rafael Hernández Colón then brings a couple of economists from the mainland. It bears mentioning that the Tobin Committee was only one committee. He actually set up 3 working groups. One was basically advisors from his own cabinet, the Treasury, the Puerto Rico Treasury Secretary, the Puerto Rico Director of Budget and Management and Budget, the Director of what was then known as Fomento, which is the agency in charge of industrial promotion. The second committee was the one that Heidie worked in, which is the Strategic Committee, which was in charge of coming up with a growth strategy for Puerto Rico, with a development strategy for the island. And then the Tobin Committee, which touched a little bit on the macro growth side, but it's mostly a finance-oriented report. It's mostly how do we get back to the bond markets. And I think part of the reason Hernández Colón, I was not there, but from what I have been able to read, part of the reason Hernández Colón chose that particular group of people he chose, these were persons from what used to be called back then the Eastern establishment here in the United States, right? And those were the people that the markets listened to, the Wall Street banks listened to. And Hernández Colón and the Democratic Party, the Popular Democratic Party in larger scope, was generally connected to that establishment for many years. Kenneth Galbraith was a good friend of Governor Muñoz Marín. Kennedy had a great relationship with other politicians in Puerto Rico. Abe Fortas, which eventually became Supreme Court Justice, was the lawyer for Puerto Rico for many years. So those connections had been nurtured for many years. And Hernández Colón, I think, realized that he needed a group of people to speak not only to Puerto Rico and Puerto Rican politicians, but most importantly to the audience here in New York and Washington specifically. And the old-fashioned word that was used, these people had gravitas, right? They were, for better or for worse, there have been a lot of criticisms, right, of that Eastern establishment. It was mostly Yale, white and male, and it's true. So it was limited in its perspective, but nonetheless, it counted with some serious intellectual firepower that could be used to make certain arguments about Puerto Rico, and that's what he did. That's what he brought to the table. It was also an interesting era in the sense that as Keynesian economics become questioned, you essentially had two paths you could take as a policymaker. You could go with the dependencia theories, which were a Marxist analysis, the whole world systems theory of the economy, which is divided the economy in 3 sectors: the periphery, semi-periphery, and the core. Puerto Rico, you could have argued was a semi-peripheral economy back then, using that, and that implied probably import substitution policies and monetary policies that Puerto Rico really couldn't implement because we don't have that power. We don't control trade, we don't control monetary policy. So the only other option was Milton Friedman and von Hayek, who had been pushing for many years their monetarist-based policies eventually became known as the neoliberal Washington Consensus, which actually generated some growth, generated a significant amount of wealth. It was not distributed equally, and I think that was one of the problems. And it created also many problems domestically for many countries that pursued that intense internationalization of the economy. We're talking basically about opening capital controls, opening up the world for trade and commerce, and opening up migration among countries. And that's how you ended up with, complicated supply chains. You ended up with just-in-time inventories, very efficient manufacturing, and very efficient operations that depended on hundreds of suppliers across the world. And that did generate a significant growth. Puerto Rico had a hard time inserting itself in that world, though. I think one of the issues we're still dealing with is we really didn't quite manage very well that transition from what essentially was a deglobalized world where Puerto Rico had common currency with the United States, a common market with the United States, completely free and open trade, completely free and trade migration between the United States, which temporarily generated some benefits for Puerto Rico, but eventually a lot of the other countries in the world came to have some of those benefits too. And that's where I think, going back to the Tobin Report, it's important because it was drafted just at that inflection point in the world economy where the world economy was moving from an economy based on fixing demand side problems towards a more globalized economy. And now, interestingly, we don't know. We may be switching back, turning the corner to a pre-1975 economy in certain ways, in terms of international trade, in terms of migration, in terms of capital flows, in terms of the benefits of trade and commerce. So who knows? I do not know. We're at another one of those points, but the interesting thing is that Tobin, who was known most of his life as a Keynesian, and one of the makers, right, one of the authors of the neoclassical synthesis between Keynesianism and neoclassical economies, up there with Solow and Samuelson, was pretty frank and open in what he was recommending to the government of Puerto Rico. I mean, he was recommending a package of austerity, and he was out in the open saying it, like, this is a new ball game, guys. This is what we have to do in order to be successful. Taking into account, again, that Puerto Rico does not have monetary policy, it has no control over its trade policy, we only have fiscal policy. And that, it's somewhat limited also by the debt markets, and obviously taxes and expenditures have certain limits, right? Only so many taxes you can impose. There's only so many things you can tax in an economy. So I think that it's important to keep those two things in mind. One, at some point, the model actually did work. There was actually some method to the madness. And in terms of what was happening at the international level between 1945 and 1975, what Puerto Rico did was the standard dual economy model, which, people here at Yale studied, and many other places. After 1975, though, it became a lot more complicated, and again, we managed to stabilize the economy. We managed to stabilize the debt at around 60% of GDP until around 2000, when we started also, issuing too much debt, finance consumption with long-term debt, and other sorts of problems. But until then, the model actually did work. And secondly, just keep in mind how difficult this situation was, not only in Puerto Rico, but internationally. Nobody really was prepared for this kind of crisis, and everybody had to improvise out of a sudden. So,
Yeah, so that's really helpful, and even I understand, right, that moment in time was a really difficult moment around the world. That the French talk about the 30 glorious years that ended then, and so this was very much an international issue that everyone was in crisis at that moment. Heidie, we've talked a little bit about the things that are a little more specific to Puerto Rico. I don't know if you have any more to add to that, and maybe good. And sort of how did that lead to the scope of the report that was commissioned, right? Because there were certain questions given to this committee, and in the more particular context of Puerto Rico. Can you talk about that maybe a little bit?
I think that what Tobin, can I have the?
Yep.
What Dr. James Tobin did was, in terms of the scope of work, when he met with Governor Hernández Colón and other members of the cabinet, was what is our scope of work? What is it that you're pursuing? And I think that what Hernández Colón suggested was, hey, we do need to address this broad fiscal and financial aspects of Puerto Rico's economic future. Things were not bad because of the oil recession in 1975. They started long before that, back in 1969. So, as I said, a period of great growth in Puerto Rico, but at the same time, it was so fast that we started growing more dependent on, and still do, on foreign investment, which is the U.S. We started depending more and more. It's almost 44% of GNP in Puerto Rico is federal transfers, and that includes Social Security and Medicare, for which we pay. They are not just grants. But anyway, it's a big force, what is happening now. And so what the key concern, as I said before, was what was the economic and financial strategies of the past 2 decades that no longer worked in Puerto Rico. So that was the big challenge. And as I said, he was very concerned, Hernández Colón, about really, since public debt was so important, even though it was small levels, but it was very important that Puerto Rico really maintain its credit standing, something that we didn't do. Because one of the things that Tobin said was, look, you have to keep your GNP growth and debt more or less at the same time, but the debt should grow less than growth. And in 1971 to 76, GNP grew on average 8.3%, and the debt grew 22.7%. That's the big oil shock and all that stuff. Then 1977 to 2001, we had some stability. They did follow after Hernández Colón, and this is one lesson that doesn't appear in the Tobin Report or in many other reports, but one lesson that Governor Hernández Colón learned was he lost the election. He did follow the austerity measures. He tried to do the best thing in terms of that development strategy. Hey, history said, no, you're not going to be reelected. So he was not elected the following administration, but he did come back, and he served for 2 terms. And of course, he learned his lesson. Austerity measures, go slow, go slow. Otherwise, it's going to cost me my job. Well, in 1977 to 2001, GNP growth on average was 7.4%, and the debt was 6.3%, so below. That was one of Tobin's recommendations. 2002 to 2014, GNP, this is all in nominal growth, not real terms, was 3.3, but the debt was already growing at 7.9%, so at twice that clip. And then 2015 through 2024, GNP was growing nominally. In real terms, it was negative, 2.3%, but the debt, because of 2015 that the governor said Puerto Rico can no longer pay its debt, it's now negative 3.3, but it's not because of fiscal management. It's really, the reality was you had now a supervisory board which renegotiates the public debt, and we can have another panel discussion about the tributes and the contributions of this board, but never mind, I'm not going to talk about that. But Puerto Rico's difficulties really arose at the time. The oil prices, which skyrocketed, as I depicted in one of the slides. The prices of agricultural products also went skyrocketing. Federal anti-inflationary policies, what they did in the U.S., did not necessarily favor Puerto Rico, and then the U.S. and global recession. All of this was happening at the same time. So a lot on Governor Hernández Colón's plate. And as Tobin recognized, very little scope for financial policies insulating the island. So Puerto Rico has little control about all these external events. And what little control it had, it just mismanaged. And that's one of the important things. The fiscal austerity measures were tax revenues increase, control government expenses, limit the public debt, keep new debt, 150 million a year. You know how much it increased? Well, on average, 1974 to 1983, public debt increased compared to the 1970-73 period by $4 billion on an annual basis. Not 150, not 300 million. Then the next one, 1984 to 2004, public debt increased by $12 billion. Never mind the 150 or 300 million, long gone. And then 2005 through 2025, guess what? $40 billion increase in public debt. It's scary. Very scary, and that almost represented 54% of Puerto Rico's GNP. So yes, a lot was going on, and certainly GDP was downgraded from its bonds. Same thing for all the GO bonds, and Puerto Rico had been a model debtor for decades, and then suddenly it was just this hairy Frankenstein, and that was a great concern for Governor Hernández Colón and his cabinet. Since the mid-2000s, Commonwealth credit image was tarnished, fiscal mismanagement by not adjusting to structural change in this economy. And that's important because we all focus on the external events, but there was an internal deindustrialization of Puerto Rico. This was before the strategy of manufacturing by invitation. Then it started changing because the U.S. economy and the world was changing. There was more free trade. Puerto Rico had been protected because it had the market to itself. That changed. Labor was an advantage. Minimum wage came along. And so all these free trade agreements, they eroded Puerto Rico's advantage. And Puerto Rico did not stay in tune with that structural change that was happening in the Puerto Rico economy. And that's important because it's happening today. And U.S. tax policy failure at government and private sectors to reshape Puerto Rico's economy. So in the end, 2015, Governor Padilla said to the world, in Barron's article, Puerto Rico cannot pay its debt. By the same token, also in that big background of the 1974s, remember there was the bankruptcy of New York City. So that was really present in all these debt markets, which they grow very nervous. They not necessarily, having worked for Salomon Brothers and for Drexel Burnham Lambert in Puerto Rico, I can tell you, there is not much depth in research. You fly by the seat of your pants. And that's exactly what these markets do to this day.
Okay, that's great. I've noticed something a little bit. Can we dig a little bit into how much were the recommendations followed in the short run, right? And what were maybe good and bad implications of that, right? So surely we've heard that by the end they were not being followed, right? But to what degree were they sort of seriously implemented for a while? I'm actually
he did.
a little confused. Yeah.
Governor Hernández Colón did adopt several of the Tobin Report recommendations. He didn't adopt all of them. He gave a message, I think it was the 30th of January, 1976, an election year. And he proposed budget cuts. He also a freeze on government wages. He also increased taxes, as his grandson reminded us in the video. The actual, as Heidie mentioned, there were controls imposed in the issuance of debt, and actually those controls were were actually in place for like 25 years. If you, I ran the entire series since 1961 up until the bankruptcy of Puerto Rico's debt growth versus GNP, I'm sorry. And the level of debt to GNP, it stayed around 59, 60% between 1975 and 2000. It is in 2000 that you see that graph just like explode. So some measures were imposed. Then Hernández Colón lost the elections in November of 1976. So we have to remember he didn't have a lot of time, to implement a lot of policy because elections were coming up, and a new administration came in with a different mindset, and they actually move away from some of the recommendations and focus more on Puerto Rico's relationship with the United States and Puerto Rico as a part of the U.S. economy and what benefits could be generated by that, as opposed to implementing these measures. But I think the one big structural change that was missed and that still is a problem in Puerto Rico, and Tobin mentioned this consistently, and it's in the report, it's the lack of domestic savings, the relatively low level of savings in Puerto Rico vis-a-vis consumption. So that essentially means you have to bring capital from somewhere else, right? In this case, the United States. But he being Tobin, he stressed over and over and over, you have to generate both public and private savings in Puerto Rico in order to have a little more, room to play, if you will. Otherwise, you're going to be completely dependent on external capital. And unfortunately, that still is a problem in Puerto Rico. We have a significant amount of consumption, relatively low savings. That structural change has not been made. I think part of that could be related to the fact that we happen to have a currency that's a lot stronger than our economic fundamentals will run generally because we have the US dollar, and that all permits a significant amount of consumption relative to if we had the Puerto Rican peso.
Yeah,
that would have other problems, right? But
right. So again, I'm going to be the naive non-macroeconomist. Is the internal savings rate in Puerto Rico something the government, given that it doesn't have its own currency, given that it doesn't have its own central bank, right? Given, right, that it has some limits on its fiscal ability as not a sovereign state with its own currency. Is that something that Puerto Rico, what policy levers would you pull, let me put the positive way, to try to pull up the internal savings rate?
That's why Tobin was in favor of wage controls. He was in favor of not imposing, which was actually very controversial back then, not imposing the federal minimum wage in Puerto Rico, which until the late 70s it was not imposed. So the report is full of measures like that that will tend to favor savings as opposed to consumption. He was also very concerned about the impact of federal transfers in Puerto Rico, which eventually have grown to become a significant part, and also it's mostly all consumption, right? So he was looking for, and the government of Puerto Rico does have, until recently, until the appointment of the oversight board, significant, room to implement fiscal policy. I mean, three elements, right? Taxes, expenditures, and debt. We could manage all three. And as Heidie said, we made some mistakes in each one, in each one of those buckets, if you will, on the tax side, on the expenditure side, and on the debt side. But we could have tinker. I mean, again, it's easy to be Monday morning quarterback, right? But there are policies that could have been implemented, right, to direct more the economy towards saving and investment and less consumption, but we did not do it.
Okay. I think I wanted to add to what Sergio was saying, that another thing that Tobin stressed was the need for planning. And he said there was going to be a new institute of economics, of statistics, and he said that role should be highlighted, especially for the Puerto Rico Planning Board, which is really now like a mouse. I mean, it's still there, but it really doesn't do much. Even for the national accounts, not even the government believes some of those statistics, but hey, it's better than nothing. And I think that it's important to learn that lesson, that planning was important, continues to be important, and Puerto Rico did do it back in the 1960s, but then did not follow that recipe. James Tobin stressed it, and may have been followed with this change in administrations, which, as I said before, and it continues to be my greatest challenge for Puerto Rico is vision. What is it that we want in terms of this economic outline of Puerto Rico? It's an island that has many opportunities, but boy, have we wasted those opportunities and continue to do so. And we have grown more and more dependent, not only on U.S. firms coming to Puerto Rico for manufacturing, but also this federal dependence on these transfer funds, which have made us maybe not our work ethics, so why should I work if I'm going to get food stamps or other aids? So on the one hand, yes, they have been good, but on the other hand, it's also this federal influence that has been an accomplice as to what Puerto Rico is today.
I want to come back to the vision thing at the end, right? Because it might be nice to end with something, forward-looking. So let me come back to that in a minute. Okay, but, you mentioned these strategies for encouraging savings and so forth, and you mentioned the politics of this, right? So it's pretty easy to understand, right, how if you go toward a population that isn't particularly wealthy today, right? And you talk about
poverty is high.
Yeah, high poverty rates, and your solution is kind of wage restraint,
That's why
less
he lost.
spending, right? Is there any way out of that? So, if you were talking to a politician about that, how should people have handled that?
It's very difficult with the constraints we face, right? I mean, again, Puerto Rico is not a sovereign state, nor are we a federal state. So we're kind of like in the middle there.
Twilight zone.
And that has some benefits and some costs. It's very hard to think of a counterfactual that you could implement given those constraints, right? You basically are subject to federal policies but have no representation in Congress, right? So you take whatever comes out of Washington. You can lobby, but that's it. On the monetary side, as I said, it's whatever the Fed does, right? You really have no influence there, just like in the mainland. You can issue debt, but there's a limit, as we found out, right, on how much debt you can increase government employment. There's a limit, as we found out, to increase government employment. You can rely on transfer payments. There's also a limit on how much Washington's willing to give at any given point, right? And we also had a federal tax exemption for U.S. companies, which was very attractive to capital-intensive companies that mostly pharma, electronics, that would move operations to Puerto Rico and allow them to declare a lot of their profits in a very low jurisdiction in the island and generate some jobs in Puerto Rico. But again, these are mostly highly capital-intensive firms. They will create some jobs, but it's not going to be the tens of thousands that we need. So when you look at the totality of the circumstances then surrounding Puerto Rico, it's very difficult. Your economic toolbox, it's almost empty, right? The levers you can really pull are completely limited. And it's interesting. I mean, what can you compare Puerto Rico to right now? I mean, what's a proper comparable? It's always an issue you have when you bring new researchers to the island, because some of them think about Ireland or Singapore or other small open economies. Some others say, no, you're part of the U.S., you're part of the the tariff system, the part of the monetary system. We have to look at U.S. Jurisdictions, but even the poorest state in
Mississippi.
in Mississippi, they have twice our GNP per capita, and the poverty rates are a lot higher in Puerto Rico. They're twice, almost 3 times the U.S. poverty rates. So I remember talking with this specific issue with Joe Stiglitz in his office in Colombia about 10 years ago. And Stiglitz said, you should look at, and this is actually what I found interesting, you should look at places that have been deindustrialized, like the Rust Belt counties in Michigan and Ohio and West Virginia, that have high poverty, low employment rates, are part of the United States, but still have been trapped in this low growth, low employment trap, if you will. And that was interesting. Doing that analysis, there are some counties in places like Michigan, in places like Ohio, in places like West Virginia, where you can see, not that that is good. I mean, I'm just saying that that it is a problem that certain regions in the United States are facing too, right? They also don't have a lot of those tools. They do have representation in Congress, but apparently hasn't been very effective in helping them, at least until recently. So what can you really do is very hard. I mean, when you put yourself in the pilot seat, you don't have a lot of things. To be honest, I mean, that are in your typical economic toolbox.
But in Puerto Rico's feather cap, there was one important thing that this tiny island of 35 by 100 miles did, and that was the connection of Congress, and that was Section 936 of the U.S. Tax Code. Back in 1976, I remember Secretary Salvador Casellas, who has long died, and he and Miguel Antonio Ferrer, they were pinching themselves when they were coming back from this achievement. And they said, really, have we achieved that? The US tax code, Section 936, allowed these companies from the US to come to Puerto Rico, manufacture in Puerto Rico, and the profits, they were tax-free. And then the profits, if you reinvested them in Puerto Rico in eligible activity, and that the role of the GDP was important in sort of overseeing this, then they too would be tax-free. And you would only pay a toll gate tax. So in a feather cap for this tiny island achieved it. It's true, we do not have control of many things. We do not have control of federal programs. We would like to change them in terms of things that would make more sense for Puerto Rico. But you know how federal bureaucracy is. So you take it or you leave it. But Section 936, no other state has had Section 936. And of course, Section 936 was a big stumbling block, again, for politics, for statehood. And so years down the road, after 76, the two governors, Governor Romero Barceló and then Governor Pedro Rosselló, decided, you know what, we have to go along with U.S. Treasury and tell them that Section 936 has to be eliminated. And they succeeded. Thank God, Congress gave Puerto Rico 10 years for this transition. And in 2006, once that section ended, because there was this transition, Puerto Rico went into a recession and has not recovered since then. So only to remember, politics is important.
This is all a little depressing at the end. If I could just get like one or two sentences of hope for the future, and then I want to turn it over to some questions from the audience. Do you have a sentence or two of hope for us?
Well, there's so many things going on in the world right now. Yes, I mean, in a sense, the future is open, right? We really don't know what's going to happen. I mean, some economists are saying, no, it's too late. We have turned the corner. We're going back to a pre-1945 economy. That would be pretty bad if you ask me. But that is not written in stone, right? I mean, that hasn't happened yet. We do still have the possibility of another world economy coming into being that is not, beggar thy neighbor and increased tariffs and basically economic warfare. So, I mean, that's a pretty nasty way. But what I'm saying is that okay, that is out there, but it's not by any means guaranteed that would happen. So we do have that option at the international level that some other ending will come about. So I think that would also have an impact in Puerto Rico in the sense, I mean, we still are a small open economy, so we are going to depend on, to a certain extent, to what happens in the United States in terms of trade and in terms of monetary policy. But with respect of what we can do is we have to finish restructuring our debt, which is almost done with the oversight board. That would be a good first step. Number two, finalize the PROMESA requirements to get the board out of the way, so we manage to finally run balanced budgets, and then we have some space. Once the board is out of the way, we do have some space to start thinking about what we can do on our own. And part of what we're looking at the center right now is like, okay, once these constraints are eliminated on our fiscal policy side, and once we have a better picture of what's happening at the global level, what makes sense for Puerto Rico? So in that sense, there's some hope. There's some we have a lot of work to do, and I cannot guarantee a happy ending, but hopefully we would have learned from what happened in 1975 and what happened in 2015 with the bankruptcy, and a new generation of policymakers. We have here the Secretary of Economic Development. We had the commissioner, resident commissioner. Both of them are in their 30s, I think. So they have a different way of looking at the world. So hopefully that would also be a factor to help us have a more hopeful future.
Great. You have one last word of hope for us, Heidie, before we turn to the audience?
One important thing that the Tobin Report was, it gave us sort of a process, a discourse on public debt and also on economic and fiscal matters in Puerto Rico. And it provided some addressing the financial issues, but he was aware, same thing that he recommended to Governor Hernández Colón, you need an economic development strategy. And this is what I go back to this initial topic of our biggest challenge is really a vision. I'm not saying that Puerto Rico doesn't have the opportunities. Always I say that because we are small, we have such great advantages. I mean, there are other countries in the world that to go to one beach, you have to go through 2 days, long ways. In Puerto Rico, you do it in 30 minutes, in an hour. You can go, this bioluminescence base that we have, it's such a biodiversity. It's a beautiful island. It is. If you have not visited Puerto Rico, please do so. The weather is, but sometimes we have some hurricanes. But other than that, the island is beautiful. And because it's small, you can go from one place to the other. But we do need to manage it accurately, and people must be engaged. And unfortunately, I don't know what happens. I see a lot of generation, is it J or Z or whatever? And it seems that you do not have the same concerns as we seniors have. And it's the world that you will live in. The cat and the dog are not going to pay your Social Security, I assure you. So you better start thinking how you're going to reproduce, because you have a big challenge ahead. So yes, there is hope, but it does require a lot of discipline and a lot of willpower and vision.
Good, thank you. So we invite rebuttals from Gen Z or any other questions. The students, Gen Alpha.
They're stunned. I can see that. They're stunned.
Some questions here, yeah. Someone's coming with the mic, yeah. Just one sec, yeah. No, we just need to, okay, we got two here, two in this row, yeah.
Okay. Hi, so there are a couple of things in the Tobin report that you guys have not talked about. He also mentioned that Puerto Rico should increase productivity and diversify its economy. So
Yes.
both the crisis back then, the 2001, and after happened partly because the large share of the Puerto Rican economy in a given sector. And I know it's very tempting when you have the level of industrial policy try to incentivize a particular sector like tourism that seems to be working. So you guys want to talk something about how industrial policy or the lack of industrial policy to help Puerto Rico increase productivity, increase competition, and diversify its economy?
Well, I think between 1945 and 1975, Puerto Rico did have sort of an industrial policy. I mean, the idea was basically to bring manufacturing, as I said, as opposed to agricultural. The first part of that transition is fairly easy, and this is documented in the economic growth literature, in the economic development literature. It's called export-led growth. Phase one, which, you depend on light industry, textiles and things like that. Puerto Rico did that fairly well. It's doing the transition to the second phase of the export-led growth, which is a lot harder. And there's a whole bunch of literature about the middle income trap and, whether or not it exists and why countries get, in this quagmire when they reach a certain level of GDP. Turns out that it's actually very difficult to, move from doing textiles to, selling cars. It's a difficult transition. Puerto Rico has managed to do some of that basically based on with federal tax breaks, right? We have a significant manufacturing footprint still in pharma, is still in medical devices, and a couple of other areas in aerospace. But we really don't have what you will call an industrial policy. There's a chance to do that now, I think, with everything that's happening. Again, the intellectual change that appears to be happening across the world away from runaway globalization and towards a more controlled and bigger role for states, right? Puerto Rico could have some room to play there with its tax policy, jointly with what happens at the federal level. But we do have to come up with, the strategy. I mean, what do we have a comparative advantage in? What are we good at? And then start going after those industries. Keep in mind, though, that the rest of the world's doing the same thing. And not only the rest of the world, the 50 states. I mean, you would be surprised what South Carolina does. I mean, South Carolina wouldn't be one of the states that come to your mind as an industrial policy haven. And they do some amazing things, like bringing, Volvo, BMW manufacturing to South Carolina. And not to mention California and other places. So the competition's pretty stiff, also pretty hard. So we have to think, first of all, I think what Heidie said is we have to take a cold, hard look. I mean, what are we good at? What are the sectors, not only manufacturing, but also tourism? There's still some niches in agriculture that we could exploit. I mean, I'm not talking about hundreds of acres, thousands of acres of coffee or things like that, but like high value added things like, herbs, spices, that we could export. And then what's the portfolio that we have of industries that where Puerto Rico does have a comparative advantage, and then go hard after those.
I'd like to add that it's not just industrial policy. And one thing that Tobin mentioned, that Puerto Rico had to remain competitive. And one of the things is, as other developed economies have found out, it's services. Now, services with the internet, distance has disappeared. It has died. And so this is an island that is in the Caribbean. If only we had a great educational system. If I don't mind, this human drain, I don't mind that, because you know what? I put a sticker and said, you are made in Puerto Rico. And do you know what that great presentation card can be? And we have thousands of people, Puerto Ricans, who are in very important positions, but we do not highlight that. And we would like, really, for Puerto Rico, that's one way to go. It's services. It's it's human. It's more labor intensive, but it is high labor intensive. It has to be followed with education, and unfortunately, our public education is just a shamble.
Can we maybe collect a couple more questions, and then we'll finish up? I think we had one here, up here.
He had a question.
And if there are a couple to collect, I don't know how many people want to talk. We could collect a couple before responding. Please.
Neither of you included the tens of billions of so far unspent federal funding left over from FEMA, HUD, CDBG, and so forth.
We'd like to see them dispersed.
So that was my question. I can't keep track of what's committed versus spent, dispersed, whatever.
Yeah.
But I think the total was close to 100 billion if you aggregated it. Massive opportunity for investment in Puerto Rico, and I'm somewhat familiar with all the limitations. But is it that the money, the programming of the money isn't what you would need as an economist to make an investment into the future? Or is it just plain inability to work through those issues, whether they're political or bureaucratic? How would you, should you have put them on your list of hopeful opportunities?
Thanks. Can I just see if there are any other questions? We should, it might be good just to collect a couple and then you can both respond.
And maybe if you have an estimate of how much remains to be spent, that would be helpful.
Yeah, of all that money, maybe 15% have been dispersed. Now, it's a complex answer because if Puerto Rico is bureaucratic, hey, 10 times more bureaucratic is FEMA and the federal government. So in order to disperse 10 cents, especially because Puerto Rico has now this image that it is corrupt, guess what? We are in a very distinguished company. But anyway, since the money is in the federal hands, they will require you, first initially they said, you spent the money, you Puerto Rico spent the money, and then you ask us for a reimbursement. Well, a bankrupt island, after Hurricane Maria, very difficult to come up with the money. And then finally, when some of those projects were presented 2 or 3 years ago, Maria was in 2017, 8 years ago. Many of these projects that were presented, hey, you know what? Inflation has increased. Now construction costs have increased. And FEMA says, well, this is the money that we have. Hey, so I cannot do the project. All the bids are really deserted.
Yeah, I'm familiar with the ugly details to a certain extent, more than I want to know. But I'm just, in a larger context, if those could be overcome, should that be on the list of
Oh, absolutely, absolutely.
Yeah, especially for the energy sector.
Yeah.
I think
$12 billion.
The money that has not been spent yet on the energy sector could definitely have a significant positive impact. One of the first things you hear from people in Puerto Rico, both who already have operations in the island or people who are thinking of bringing any kind of operation, be manufacturing, service, or whatever, is like, energy costs in the island are very high, are off the charts, literally. And there are many factors for that. Here, though, as you know, the government electrical agency is still in bankruptcy. That's the one debt issuance that we haven't solved. And that makes it very difficult. Even though we have a bunch of federal money sitting there that could be spent, a lot of contractors and private sector people who work in that industry are saying, well, do we really know if this company is going to exist, who's going to be running this, or what's happening? So there's a lot of uncertainty, and you know this. But certainly in that sector, we can definitely have, also on housing, there's a $20 billion on HUD, on CBDG, that basically has not been touched at all, basically. And part of the problem had to do with the grant agreements that were negotiated. As you know, they had a whole bunch of unreasonable conditions on Puerto Rico that has been documented by the HUD Office of Inspector General. So I'm not going to go into the details. But it's taking a while to get around those constraints in those agreements. My main concern, though, is that these things could be clawed back by the federal government. The current director of OMB, it's kind of like prone to do this, has done it already with Green Energy Fund investments for not only for New York City, but some projects in Puerto Rico too. But and also wind projects that were almost 80% done in certain parts. So it is a real risk. We have a political risk, but I do agree. Yes, if we manage to break that logjam, especially in the energy sector, yes, that would be very helpful.
I'm going to count that as something optimistic, and I think we had one more person. And then we should probably take our break. I think that's right, yeah.
All right. Hi, everybody. Thanks so much for this session today. I'm a graduate student here in neuroscience, so forgive me. My expertise is not in economics. As one of the few members here, maybe with Gen Z, I can at least make a comment on what was said.
Very good.
I think maybe part of the reason why our generation might not be as engaged as I think is not particularly the focus of many political campaigns on the island, and I think some of the policies aren't really focused towards addressing the concerns of Gen Z people on the island. I guess my question was more, and sorry to bring it back to sort of depressing sort of situation, but I do think it might be depressing, but it is reality, right? As somebody who studied in the public university system there, I can see the classrooms and the state the classrooms are in. I can see the faculty shortages at the university. So these are things that people can feel, and I had many classmates who ended up leaving the island because of those reasons, going to study in the US and other universities. So I think my question really is trying to understand, to the degree that austerity might sometimes be warranted, is there a point where these policies tie into the mass immigration that we see in Puerto Rico, and is there a point where too much austerity leads to this mass immigration that we're seeing, and is that detract from some of the potential goals of these policies?
Well, it's interesting. If you look at going back to the Tobin Report, the committee, at least through the final report, they never advocated, taking an axe to all government expenditure willy-nilly and just, cut spending just for cutting spending. Actually, several places he says it will be a mistake to cut back on public investment, and he makes that very clear. I mean, he says, if you're going to cut in these other places that do not touch, that are not public investment. And again, it's always tricky. So for some reason, expenditure in education is counted as consumption, public consumption, opposed to public investment. But it is really an investment. The thing is that most of it is, paying for teachers. So that's why it's in our, by the way, our 1930s GDP accounting framework is still counted as consumption as opposed to investment. So I would say that, and I think right now we are in a position where we can be a lot more strategic as to where do we cut and where do we invest. Having ended the central government bankruptcy, having restructured the debt, that gives us some space to start thinking about these things and about the future. One thing we have to think really hard is the public university. There are many theories as to what should be done with it. Unfortunately, it has declined significantly in both its financial standards and academically also a little bit, some would say a lot, but so we really have to think, I mean, we need a strong public university for Puerto Rico to be successful in the future. What form that university should take is still an open question, and I think one of the things that should be top of that, on top of that priority list is public education, but specifically the university level education. When you're talking about economic growth and economic development, you need a strong academic partner. I mean, Yale does it, MIT does it, all the public universities, Berkeley, UCLA. Not that this administration is doing anything to help research, but that's a different issue. Once we get away from what's happening with Trump, I mean, that's an area where Puerto Rico definitely has an opportunity. The University of Puerto Rico used to bring top-notch talent. José Ramón knows this. José Ramón, I mean, people from Europe, people from the United States. And talking about vision, back then, there were people who were willing to think big, really big, and roll the dice and see what happened. And we seem to have lost that that ability. And to give you a quick example, the government of Puerto Rico actually proposed to Robert Oppenheimer to open a physics lab in the island. This is after he had lost his, security clearance and, the entire mess. I mean, somehow the government of Puerto Rico found out that Robert Oppenheimer used to spend winters in St. John's in the Virgin Islands. And they made an offer to him and said, come here to the University of Puerto Rico. You could do anything you want. You have free range, to have the physics lab of your dreams. And Oppenheimer said, if I did not have cancer, I would. I mean, there's a letter. If I were not almost at the end of my life, and I'm taking care of my graduate students, literally, he was placing his graduate students, I would take you right away on this offer. But Puerto Rico doesn't do that anymore. That's the kind of big picture thinking that we need back again.
Good. Vision. Let's stop there. We're going to take a little break, right? There are bathrooms behind us here. There are bathrooms also on the second and third floors above them if those get a little crowded. And when should we be back? 5 minutes, we'll say. Okay.
That was an excellent panel. I've heard really great feedback already. So let's do that again. This time around, we're going to be focusing on the actual implementation side of things. Universities have long been engines of new ideas and rigorous analysis, yet that path from that academic insight into government action is not always as straightforward as we'd like it to be. So in this discussion, we're going to focus on how research can inform economic development and public policy in real time, drawing on lessons from Puerto Rico's current challenges and the experience of the Yale Tobin Center. And so joining us on stage today is David Wilkinson, the founding executive director of the Tobin Center for Economic Policy here at Yale, a former senior White House official. He has also held cabinet-level roles under 2 Connecticut governors and is widely recognized for advancing data-driven, evidence-based policymaking. Mike Soto-Class is the founder and former president of the Center for a New Economy. I say that I have hard shoes to fill, but I'm just putting heels on them. I'm not filling them. He built CNE into what CNE is today, the leading nonpartisan think tank in Puerto Rico, and he's now serving as chairman of the board. And finally, the Honorable Sebastián Negrón Reichard is Puerto Rico's Secretary of Economic Development. He's a graduate of Harvard Business and Harvard Law School, but we won't hold that against him here today. And also the Wharton School at the University of Pennsylvania. He brings extensive experience across the public and private sectors, from strategy and finance to law and governance. Together, they really do represent that kind of collaboration between institutions and government leaders that makes this dialogue possible. So with that, join me in welcoming on stage all of our panelists, and we'll have some introductory remarks from Sebastián. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much for the opportunity to be here. It's truly an honor. I am very thrilled to share this afternoon with you all, with distinguished guests. Here at Yale, an institution where ideas are not only born but tested, challenged, and turned into purpose. To share this moment with you all is very important, not only here, but for the ramifications that it can have in Puerto Rico. So many thanks for the center for the invitation. I often ask myself, where does progress truly begin? It seldom begins with a single decision or even a single vision. It begins, perhaps, when thought gives way to wonder. I mean, when curiosity dares to imagine the possibility. And this is what a new generation of leadership in Puerto Rico represents. The resident commission is 34, I'm 31. And many people would have hoped that I had more work experience before landing this job. But part of what I see with the problem and the opportunity of Puerto Rico is a challenge of implementation. It's a challenge of spending 50 years researching and putting things on paper, which is very important. But I dare to invite everyone to think about the importance of also implementing 3 out of the 100 solutions. And so that is what I think is very important that we bring to the government. The world is changing. Of course, we know what's happening at the federal level. And I have to tell you that from a Puerto Rico perspective, we've seen a lot of interest in Puerto Rico. I was at the MedTech conference on Monday and then at the CHIPS conference on Wednesday before coming here. And many people are asking, what is Puerto Rico's role given the New World Order? And of course, I'm not saying that reshoring is an economic development solution or the goal of the Puerto Rican economy, but I have to tell you with hope that we are seeing interest in the role that Puerto Rico can play in the world economy. In the last 10 months, we've announced, it's not the 5,000 that you mentioned, but 3,000 new job commitments, $1 billion in investment. Amgen, 2 weeks ago, announced $650 million investment in Puerto Rico, creating 750 jobs. And we are in the midst of negotiations for 3 or 4 bold and big announcements in the next few months that I cannot announce until I sign the contract. But I would love to announce it right now so that you believe me. But reshoring is not only about bringing production back. It's about bringing people back. It's about investing in our talent ecosystem. And Heidie, you're right in that we need to invest in our education. And more than education, in the workforce, right? Our workforce, the governor is really adamant that we organize the workforce strategy. Because you have the Department of Human Resources on one side, you have the Department of Economic Development going in a different direction, the University of Puerto Rico in a different direction. It's everyone is doing something different. So we need to bring everyone to the table and figure out how many people do we want to train in the next 5 years, and what are the goals, and what are the industries. And so we're trying to bring industry to the table to understand what they need, and the university as well. The university is a crown jewel. It is sitting on a lot of cash. They need to implement change. They need to hire world-class professors. And I would dare to say that they have the money to do so. Of course, it's not without challenges, but it's an implementation issue. And so I think that as we think about what is part of our strategy moving forward, it must be confidence in that Puerto Rico can move from the bankruptcy, which we've almost gotten through, only prepa, which is very important that we finish, but almost through the bankruptcy. The hurricanes are behind us. We have billions of dollars, as you discussed, to implement. So it's kind of a perfect storm now. You have a young generation dying to come back to Puerto Rico. You have Bad Bunny putting our name throughout the world. And you have companies really interested in our talent. I kid you not that when I talked to the Medtronic CEO this week and the Stryker CEO, they both said, your talent is the best in the nation. So again, while everything is not perfect, there are some things that we must celebrate and know where to build from. The last thing I'll say is that as we work towards bringing confidence to Puerto Rico, we need to add discipline. And discipline is that we show what the roadmap is. So we're fully in agreement with what we need a plan that everyone can rally behind. Simple, 3-page, and that it has a role for the young people, a role for the millennials, a role for the older generation, and that everyone knows where we're going. We might not all agree that it's perfect, but at least we know where we're going. And what's the growth target? No one knows what the GDP growth target is or should be. I have my perspective, but we should have a possibility that everyone is talking about it, right? And that, I think, is the opportunity of academia and government coming together, and of course the private sector with a few dollars here and there, to come up with a plan that might not be perfect, but at least we can implement. And so right now that we have stopped the huge brain drain and that we have a clean slate with the debt restructuring and that we have people dying to live and work on the island that, saw them grow, it's a perfect storm. And at least from the Department of Economic Development and Commerce and the governor, we're doing everything possible to make sure that Puerto Rico is a place that can grow, that can attract people back, but we are hoping that we can work with the academia, with CNE, and with the private sector to make sure that we have a blueprint that everyone understands and that we follow and implement. Because without implementation, we will have thousands of reports and people fleeing the island. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Sebastián. I wanted to mention something. Well, first of all, thank you all for coming. It's been great so far. I am particularly thankful to the folks at the Tobin Center for allowing us to partner with them and put this together. Steve, in particular, we've been trying to put this together for a couple of years. I appreciate your patience and helping us out with this. Laura for coming and being a part of it. Heidie for coming from Puerto Rico and sharing with us. Daniel, who has always been my conspirator here at Yale, my co-conspirator in trying to get more things about Puerto Rico happening here. Thank you to all of you. I'm sure I missed out. The Tobin team has been incredible. But I wanted to say two things before we start with the panel, if you'll indulge me just for 3 minutes. One is to answer your question, Steve, from the last panel on, what's the hope, what's the good news. It's very difficult for me. I've been at this for so long. I've gotten cynical, and Laura and I were talking about this, and she noticed. But for me, and I realized this, here, like when Rosanna was talking, and she did her imagine thing, I thought it was fantastic. I thought it was fantastic, and that's the good news, that we have people like Rosanna and Sebastián and Pablo, José, and a lot of the others that are here. They care enough to be here. Rosanna is putting her life into this, and she can imagine those things. There's no better news than that. I think Puerto Rico has a lot of problems, but as long as we have things like this and people like Rosanna, that's great news. I think we're on the right track and we're going to be fine. And then the second thing is, and I'll just do this very quickly, this is, I don't want this to just be kind of a theoretical exercise of an event. I kind of want to explain why I thought when we started talking about doing this that it was important to do it. I studied political science here at Yale. I graduated a long time ago, back in 1991. And during that time, because you're studying that, you learn about the ecosystem of think tanks in the US and globally. And so I was very, very familiar with that. And after graduation, I was drafted to work at a gubernatorial campaign in Puerto Rico, and particularly in the platform of the campaign. And it was very interesting because it was an entirely and incredibly partisan project. We drafted, and I don't say that in a critical way. I think that's how campaigns work. But we consulted only folks from that party to create the platform, which, if you win, becomes the plan of government. So it's an incredibly partisan project. And I had similar experiences after that when I was working in government. Great ideas that couldn't go forward because they came from the wrong place. And this is something that in Puerto Rico we've been used to for a long time. But now we're seeing it grow into other areas in the US. But it's always seemed to me that the best way to craft and develop policy is through research and through evidence-based research and through empirical research. And that way you can create policies that are good for people. You shouldn't craft policy thinking about, well, this is what's going to get me reelected, so we'll do this policy, or this is a policy that's going to help the contributors to my campaign, and so we'll do this policy. That's not the way that you should do this. You should do it through research, and I think this is where the academic setting then comes into this. You know, this is why we're here and why we're talking about it. Obviously, it has an impact, and Heidie mentioned it. Hernández Colón, who had the vision to not only use outside intelligence, but to seek it, lost the election. So it has repercussions, and I do understand that this is not, you know, just a simple thing. And in fact, you know, the environment is getting even more difficult. But it goes to where, and the reason behind why I started CNE in 1998 in Puerto Rico, because I thought, you know, there should be at least one institution in Puerto Rico where we can propose policies, where we can think about the economy in a nonpartisan way, where we're not thinking about how do we get reelected, where we're not thinking about how can I make this particular industry more profitable. No, that we're thinking about what's the best for as many people as possible in Puerto Rico, and that's the genesis of CNE, a nonpartisan place, a nonprofit institution, and an independent perspective. And I think, you know, universities also are not just repositories for students. I think, and Rosanna mentioned it, you know, they're engines of knowledge. You know, these are places, you know, Daniel in his laboratory, you know, the things that come up there are just amazing. And as such, I think universities have a responsibility to the public. And I think likewise, government has a responsibility to the public as well to try to create the best government possible. And so here in our panel today, we have both of those. You know, we have Dave, who directs the Tobin Center. Here at Yale, we have the academic part of it, and then we have Sebastián, who is part of the government in Puerto Rico, a policymaker. So I think it's a great opportunity in order for us to talk about this. And then lastly, and I'll start after this, I think it's also very fitting for so many reasons that we're doing this here. So Professor James Tobin, you know, renowned Yale economist, gets called upon to work on Puerto Rico. Now we're back at Yale, where he was a professor, to talk about the report he did on Puerto Rico at the Tobin Center. But then I think for me, even more than that, that we're doing it at Yale and in Connecticut, which is a place that I think has such a shared history and such a deep bond with Puerto Rico, especially New Haven and Hartford, you know, huge density of Puerto Ricans here. And so I think it's very fitting that we're doing this not just at the Tobin Center, not just at Yale, but in Connecticut. And so I thank everybody for being here, and I'm very much looking forward to the conversation today. And I think I'll start with you, David, if I can, and ask you, how do you balance at the Tobin Center? I mean, I think, you know, government has needs sometimes that are at a different speed than what we can sometimes work at. So how do you deal with that? How do you balance those needs, and maybe some real life examples about how that's occurred here?
Yeah, thank you. And thanks everyone for being here at the Tobin Center. We couldn't be more thrilled. This is what we're all about. And so thanks to CNE for giving us this opportunity. It's tough. The Tobin Center works to reduce the time between research and impact. And we're animated by this mission that it's one of our best chances to move the needle on many of the challenges facing society is to look at what the evidence says. Where there isn't evidence, to build it, and to help government be driven by outcomes and seeking better ones in particular. But the barriers are significant. when I was at the White House, I got the opportunity to run something called the White House Office of Social Innovation. President Obama's mission for that was to find what works and make it work for more people. And we quickly centered around universities as a source of great capacity to do the kind of evidence building and data and analytics that could help local, state, territory, county, federal jurisdictions generate the insights they need to advance demonstrably better results. But it's really challenging. I think a lot of people will give the answer that's clear when you're close, which is the incentives are often misaligned. Faculty, and in particular junior faculty, have an incentive to publish. And policymakers and leaders are putting out fires 90% of the time. Like, you don't get to do too much of the fun stuff. Most of your time is, oh, this went wrong, okay, how do we fix that? And aligning that is tough. I remember an insight, or something that happened when I was at the White House that highlighted this for me. There was an amazing faculty member at a peer university somewhere else who had done wonderful work on understanding the connections between certain activity and future employment and earnings. Really important. President Obama was very interested in the criminal justice system and what were the conditions that enabled earnings to and future stability to be unlocked. That same university had the best faculty member, one of them in the country, on those sorts of criminal justice related recidivism avoidance questions. And I thought, I've got the answer. We'll just get these two professors together, and this professor will share their data, and then, you know, chocolate peanut butter, and we've got Reese's cups. And I called the professor, criminal justice. He said, "Oh, I can't get that data. That's his, literally 3 doors down." This one professor had the answers, and another professor had the question, but couldn't get that data to answer an incredibly important question that the President of the United States wanted to act on. And for which there was a short window of time to do so. And it didn't get answered. That, for me, as a non-academic, was a story about, initially, incentives, but it's also about the barriers. It's not that the faculty member down the hall wouldn't share. It's that they didn't have the systems, the ability, the infrastructure, the data use agreement to do so. And so part of what we can do is try to unlock those opportunities, reduce the barriers, make those types of, bridge those gaps. And if academia is going to be more relevant to policymakers, we need to be willing and able to roll up our sleeves, sit where they sit, understand their motivations, and determine how we can deploy our really unique, talented capacities in advancing their needs. And so I'll talk a little bit more about that. But one example is that right here in New Haven, with New Haven Public Schools, we have some wonderful faculty members. I'm thinking John Eric Humphreys, Chris Nielsen, Seth Zimmerman, who've worked with New Haven Public Schools. And you know what New Haven Public Schools' big challenge was one summer? It was figuring out how to have more efficient bus routes for their kids for a range of important reasons. And it's not going to get you a published paper in Econometrica, which is our faculty's incentives. But it does open doors. And not only do you get to do good, which motivates students and other junior scholars, it creates trust and goodwill that gives faculty access to the kind of data they need to answer groundbreaking solutions. And later that faculty group did answer an amazing, multiple, I think, really important questions that have been cited around the country and have affected policy around the country. But it takes building that trust and faculty seeing that in doing good, in rolling up sleeves, in centering themselves in the needs of policymakers and their challenges today, they can also do the bigger picture analysis that may be more globally relevant.
And parallel to that, Mr. Secretary, how do you see the way that, for example, the government can either signal the needs that they have for research or for information or data, or some kind of relationship? You know, Dave was talking, there was actually an office in the White House for this, but not everybody has that capacity. So what are ways that communication can occur more efficiently?
Puerto Rico, in our case, has a lot of challenges, which means a lot of opportunities, right? And so a few examples of areas where we're already working with academia. One, we needed to get done a dashboard of all the air cargo facilities in Puerto Rico. So immediately some staffer went and got a quote from a consultant for $1 million. I'm like, hell no. And we hired a local university in Puerto Rico for $30,000 with a professor and 5 students who are having the time of their life, putting together a dashboard that will be utilized by Puerto Rico for air cargo use. It's not like the most sophisticated intellectual thing, but it's so easy to integrate government and academia. Another problem, this we haven't solved. We don't have quarterly GDP statistics. So we're trying to work with UPR Mayagüez to figure out how can we implement a method so that we can set them up. The latest official GDP that came out a few weeks ago for 2023, and that is like not helpful at all for us as policymakers to make decisions based on that. And another problem, statistics are spread throughout the government. We have the Institute of Statistics, but they're more focused on publishing the statistics as opposed to like the actual convening and analysis of them. So the first few months, it was like reckless. Like the one department publishes the employment data, and another department publishes economic development data. The government bank publishes economic data. It's all a mess. Like, it doesn't make a lot of sense, and the announcements are not coordinated. So now at least we get a heads up of when information is going to come out so that we as a department can be prepared to explain it, because the average person needs to understand the very technical things that come out of a statistics report. But that is an area where I think we can work a lot with academia to streamline access to data, having one report per quarter while we get quarterly GDP, explaining what's happening. Cement sales are up, gasoline is down, like what's up, how to explain that. And lastly, I think the innovation, the social impact idea is really, it's great, and I kind of copied it. I hired 4 younger than me, very talented former consultants, or really just like talented folks that now have, it's called the Secretary's Innovation Lab. They literally all sit together and like come up with ideas of how to disrupt what we have. And so I'm thrilled. I mean, from there, one person, Diego, who left his startup job in New York City to come work with us, is like coordinating their reshoring strategy by getting 50-year-olds on a call that never used to talk to each other. And someone from the private promotional entity, the consultants, someone from the governor's office in DC. And so it's a lot of coordination that is not like, it's not rocket science. So adding the academia side is very important in that coordination.
I think that's great. I didn't know, and I applaud that. And following up, Dave, on your bus example, your bus routes, you know, I mean that's a great one. It seems like that's something where both parties are happy. But research is not always kind of, you know, that nice, right? Sometimes you uncover things that government doesn't want uncovered, or that is not as friendly as that. It was interesting because we found a reference to the Tobin Report that mentioned protests at Yale that had occurred after it was published, and I imagine, that must have affected him. Do you ever worry about how your research or the outputs of the Tobin Center will be received, or have you had any examples of something along those lines where it's kind of difficult to speak truth to power?
I think the Tobin Center has done a pretty good job of making everybody mad here and there on both sides of the aisle, because if we're going to have credibility, we need to be, what matters to us is truth. And we need to be seen authentically as being independent of particular political agendas. And by the way, things change. Leadership changes as we've seen. And it's good to be able to point to a track record of we've pointed to truth, and we've got some inconvenient truths for people on the left. We have some inconvenient truths for people on the right. But it's always sincere. It's always real. And so at the moment, so I will say both of those things. At the same time, we're very interested in translating research into impact, which means there needs to be someone to receive the pass on the other side. And at the Tobin Center, our job is to make it as easy as possible to catch that pass. And so we do actively seek avenues of potential where there can be bipartisan agreement. As a policy-focused center, we're not looking to run at in political directions that are impossible to make headway on because of partisan gridlock. That is not the smart choice if you want to get practical things done. We are looking for secretaries in states and leaders at the federal and local level who are interested in acting on practical things today. We're seeing a lot of promise in the areas around supply side and strategies referred to often as abundance, state capacity strategies, or addressing issues like grid queues. And so workforce strategies, more efficient approaches and ways of expanding child care. And we run where traction can be purchased.
That's great. And speaking of partisanship, Mr. Secretary, we've mentioned over the course of the day the polarization that exists today. As I mentioned, in Puerto Rico, we've had that for a very long time, particularly in the political space, because of the political parties. You've been there just a short amount of time, but has that had an impact? And how do you deal with that polarization that we have? That's kind of the old polarization, the political polarization, and then now joined by the greater polarization that we see in the country overall.
I think what we have in Puerto Rico is very similar to what we see at the federal level. It's just on different topics. So it's very hard to navigate. I have to say that in my case, because we are seeing momentum and backlogs are behind us in some permitting cases and in some management of administrative things that bothered everyone, I have seen support on both sides of the aisle. Who can be against new factories opening and new jobs being announced? So thankfully, in that sense, I have seen openness to collaborate and work at the legislature from elected leaders. There are other topics that we need to look at that will probably not be received in the same way. As we think about what are some of the tools that we have for economic growth and changing the nature of the economy today, like our safety, our food stamp system, and the fact that there is no work requirement. We want access to a system that has work requirements from the NAP to SNAP transition, for example. And so when we address that question that I know that the governor and the team were heavily looking into, How do we grow our labor participation rate, which is the lowest in the nation, of 45%? Well, that is a potential area. So how do we look at it? That is going to create a lot of discussion, but I think as we prepare to come in that direction, we need to have facts, we need to have examples, we need to tell the story, and whatever decision, this is something that the governor has always, is always telling us, like, explain what we're gonna do with very specific examples that matter to the average person and how this impacts. And so, whereas I started the term by like, new job, yay. Now it's like a family in Juncos has the potential to not leave Puerto Rico. And it's a much more impactful way of expressing the things that we have to do. And so if we get better at explaining things, I think, and we're not afraid of having a frank discussion, I think the polarization can come down.
And this is a question for both of you guys. You can both answer, but we kind of live in a set of circumstances in our centers and in our jobs that function under this belief that experts are valuable. But I think we are entering, and maybe have been for a while now, into a crisis of expertise and trust. And I was reading some data. This is fascinating. According to Pew Research, in the 1950s, more than 70% of Americans trusted the federal government. Today, that number is around 20%. And globally, they have found that 7 in 10 people believe that government officials, business leaders, and journalists deliberately mislead the public. And so we're seeing more and more of this. What do you think this means for the kind of work that we're doing, you as a policymaker and us as people that work in think tanks?
Why don't you go?
Sure. I think it's an opportunity to, when at least from the government policy perspective, I think about why is there opposition, or why do people feel so strongly about something in the public realm or in social media. I think it's an opportunity to bring people to the table. And so when we are making decisions as to where do we go next on X or Y decision, I think it's helpful, and at least it's worked for me, to bring everyone to the table, left to right in the political spectrum. And even if you know they will completely oppose the ideas, but they will do so in a controlled fashion. And it is harder to then go and criticize and destroy the other side if you have been included and involved in the conversation. And many times, if you are a reasonable public leader, you will change your opinion, or you will moderate based on what other people are saying. And so I think that it's less about, fighting each other in the public realm, but more bringing people to the table, even if they represent a completely different perspective. And I think in the Puerto Rico perspective, that can be very helpful, because we all feel very strongly about what we need to do to change and fix Puerto Rico. And so, why not just include everyone? And maybe at the end you have to make a decision, and the governor was elected, so she's the one that will make the decision. But at least when you include everyone, it just feels right, from my opinion.
Your statistic is from a high point in trust in systems. America and the world has a history of, even recent last few hundred years, challenge with high partisan related mistrust and trusting your own sources. We had a great thing going with a few vectors of information that people could trust and believe, whether it was their paper or Tom Brokaw. And now that is broken. People are in individual sort of information silos, and we have new technology that we still don't entirely understand, and universities have a role to play in better understanding that. None of that is the domain specifically of the Tobin Center, which is looking to work on practical issues to address challenges today. However, there's a question of whether the answers we provide will be trusted. And I think to the extent universities are generators of knowledge and have long been holders of knowledge, we have to look at ourselves and we have to interrogate ourselves on what role we may have had to play in that, in those perceptions, even though there may be many more. And from my perspective, I mean, as we know and has been referred to, universities are not in a comfortable position in the country right now. And feeling maybe historically under attack. And it's never been more important, I think, for universities like Yale and scores of our peers to demonstrate how we are generating value on day-to-day kitchen table issues. With whether it's the affordability crisis, whether it's the cost of health care, whether it's people's ability to access child care or the safety in their homes, related to climate issues. Now is the time for us to deliver and showcase how we can deliver in ways that people feel beyond, their social media stream.
And I think a way to allow that, and I think it could be very helpful to us in the government in Puerto Rico, is let's embed teams from academia into government, and then keep the spin wheel of academic knowledge creation, but with a twist of seeing the reality inside the government. Because from Yale or Harvard, it's really nice to say, government of Puerto Rico should do this and that. But when you go in and you see 500 workers in my department that haven't had a decent wage raise in decades, how are you going to get them to implement the fantastic policy, right? So embedding academia into government is something that I think we could work on together. And I'm formally asking you for help. And we can build on that trust together, because it could be a way for us to solve problems together.
I'm so glad that you said that. And I think if there's one call to action from this session, it's that universities have a lot to offer jurisdictions like Puerto Rico. And in particular, we found at the Tobin Center that embedded teams are absolutely one of the best solutions. It was an embedded team that figured out the bus rates and also did bus routes, and also has done nation-leading education research. We have got 18 fellows embedded Connecticut state government right now. We have data scientists solving.
How many in Puerto Rico?
Let's talk, Mr. Secretary.
Just checking.
We'll take this one.
Yeah.
I got to cut it, but you guys you got to keep
That is
talking.
to say, this is how universities can bring value. It is center in your needs and understand where we can really authentically, without ego, deliver for your cause.
I want to make sure that we can take at least one or two questions from the audience. So the first one or two is going to get the only chance. José Ramón and Miguel. Unless there's a student that wants to do one, and I'll do a third one, then all right, good, because that's important. So José Ramón, Miguel, and then el estudiante.
Muy bien. A question for the secretary, and it really relates to this latter part of the conversation. I have found that oftentimes the issue is not the enthusiasm and commitment at the top from people like you. And I've been there, 31-year-old running a government agency back in the 80s. The issue really is, how do you turn that enthusiasm into actual execution, sustained and sustainable execution of public policy as you go down through the ranks. I have always felt that Puerto Rico has a systemic execution problem in the public sector that we didn't always have. We did not always have that. But as public administration became much more subject to the vagaries of administration changes beginning in the 1970s, the culture of civil service and the ability to sustain execution down the ranks in government has suffered. What would you say to address that?
First, I just want to say that José Ramón is my former boss, and I have learned so much from you, and many times when I'm making decisions, I think, what would you do? And so I hope you know that I'm very proud of having learned from you. I'm not. I think the problem, José Ramón, is that many people in these shoes are focused on the external, like the news, and rightly so, the fires. But you need to run the agency like it is running a company, and you need to put metrics and switch people and fire and hire. Just to give you an example, I mean, we're tasked with business retention and expansion. Guess how it used to be managed? How do you manage the leads and the relationship with the companies? It was all done on email. This 27-year-old that left his startup and started work for us implements Salesforce starting next week. And so it's just a matter of assigning, okay, you are in charge of expanding the pharmaceutical sector, right? Well, you have to submit 10 calls per week. And if you don't, then that's your first memo. And we'll sit down with you and figure it out. It's a lot of like common sense things that you would do in a company that weren't being implemented in the public sector. Another example, the employees had no idea of the org chart of the department. Like there's a public one, right? But like who do you report to 3 levels ahead, and why are you actually doing this? That's also something important, like that you understand that you're doing something in the bigger service of. Lastly, I think when you work in an agency, you want, like if you are an assistant working on, let's say, permitting, you want to understand how what you're doing impacts economic development as a whole, right? So we're going to implement DDEC Academy, which is 2 weeks for every new employee. You have to go through an academy and understand, even if you're going to be a secretary, like an administrative assistant, what is GDP and how does doing X at the small level impact GDP? And we're going to get the entire department to go through DDEC Academy in a year so that people like understand what they're doing. At a startup, that is core. Everyone knows what they're doing. Everyone knows the goal. Everyone's pushing, and there is no reason why it shouldn't be the same in the government.
Good. And Miguel, very quickly, we'll do both.
I'll try to be as quick as I can. First, let me just say, Mike, about 10 years ago when I wanted to get more involved with Puerto Rico affairs, everybody kept saying, you know, Mike is the one person that understands the economic dynamics of the island better than no one else. And I wanted to thank you for not only your stewardship, but for also building the CNE, which is truly, it will be and it continues to be a legacy project for the island, one that hosts and will continue to protect the best ideas for generations to come. So thank you for your leadership.
It's a team.
Absolutely. I have a question centered around continuity, coordination, and implementation of our economic development agenda. And particularly one that has to do with the role of the private sector. And before I ask, let me just say 3 things. One, given what is going on in DC these days, it seems like there will be a shift away from the government and more into the private sector in terms of dealing with our social issues. And that shift has been empowered with the current tax bill. But it just seems like there is promises that it will continue to be that way, even if there is a political change. Secondly, after 10, 15 years of austerity in Puerto Rico, the government has to be rebuilt. And I think our expectations of what we expect from the government today might be too high. And thirdly, we have a small window to marshal a reconstruction plan for the island and make the most of the funding that was accelerated by the work of the Biden administration. And so I wonder, what can the private sector do? And I say that because in my role with the Biden administration, I have seen other states that have organized around economic development ideas, have been able to put the private sector, banking, academia, NGO, and the government, and ensure a level of continuity into some of these plans that could benefit, plans that could, programs or ideas that could benefit a place like the island. I bet you guys have seen something like this. I wonder if there's any thoughts around it. Thank you.
So I'll start with that. Were you going to do two questions in once? Or?
No,
yeah.
let's do this one.
And I'll touch on both of these. Both of you talked about the challenges of implementation and states' ability to do so. It was the theme of your speech, was implementation. And I think a thing we really need to recognize is that states, federal government, local government, there is a continuing array of regulation and process and requirements that actually are talking about state being able to do things, the ability of the private sector to come in. It is harder and harder to do things as we have this pileup of rules and standards that come at Puerto Rico from the territory level, the federal level, from sometimes the local level, all different types of interest groups with capacity to weigh in, stop, prevent, and then a bunch of private and public sector obligation to feed that beast, which delays getting things done for people. And what having run two state agencies, my experience that I saw is that there was just a tremendous focus, and the result of this is that there's much more focus on process and compliance than outcomes and impact. The shifting gaze back to those priorities will mean calling this out, will mean really addressing it. And yes, the private sector, I think, can be indispensable partners. Universities, in this case, we're the private sector. We want to help in small ways. We want you to do the $30,000 grant instead of the $1 million one. But sometimes you do want that big one. And I think that there is a role, and the private sector can often be more nimble. But another thing, I'll flag some research that we just put out this past week on the California Department of Transportation. One of the ways that states, territories are caught up is it's very hard to hire. It's hard to hire anyone new, and we don't play market rate, so it's hard to hire the best people. Zach Liskow, who is on the Tobin Center faculty board and a big friend of the Tobin Center, just put out research showing that getting a top-level engineer in a Department of Transportation generates about $700,000 more per year in value for the state than having an engineer that is lower quality skill set, not pedigree, but sort of this sort of layers of skills. You can read the paper. The point is, there's a lot of value in having expertise at the state level, hiring well, and identifying ways to remove barriers, and have the capacity to properly and effectively manage the private sector partners to the outcomes you hope to achieve. So private sector isn't being managed to just comply with some grant standards.
I think we're really out of time, so just a last quick question from the student, because you're why we're here, so.
Thank you so much. My question's for the secretary, and it's trying to understand the administration's perspective when trying to tackle these goals and thinking about sort of your starting remarks and saying that the university has the funding, but it's really implementation, and also that the hurricanes are behind us. I mean, I think from the removal of the standardized formula for allocating funds to university, from then to now, we've seen funds drop close to 50%, enrollments down, around maybe 20%, hirings frozen and also decreased. So I think I have trouble seeing how the existing funding is enough. And also, in terms of the hurricane, I think in September, the U.S. Office of the Inspector General, stated that around 92% of the approved or allocated projects for the power grid have not been completed. So I also think, the hurricane does not really seem to, or the effects of the hurricane don't really seem to be behind us yet.
That's a fair point. I guess with my remarks, I was mentioning that exact point on the funding available, that there is a unique opportunity to actually disperse and use the funds. I'm not implying that they have been dispersed already. If these funds, when they flow to the economy, they will have a very important impact, albeit it is temporary. So we can't just use that and expect that everything's gonna be great. But it has to be both, how do we fix the underlying issues of the economy while getting the money out the door? I guess what I'm saying, I was trying to shed a more hopeful note in terms of the future of Puerto Rico, that we have the money, we have young people like you and me that really want to be at some point in Puerto Rico and develop a family there and make sure that we don't have to leave. And so I think it's space for a new generation to also get into government and roll our sleeves and not just expect that someone's going to do it for us. We have to do it ourselves. And on your first point, remind me the question. The university funding. I'm not by any means saying that the situation is great or that there is no freeze. Tuition has gone up. All of that I take, and it's not good that we have a freeze on hiring or bringing professors. But at the same time, I believe that there are some funds that have been allocated to the university for them to meet some milestones that haven't been met, that would unlock a lot of cash to implement some things. And so if those are not the right milestones, then the university should be coming to the table and saying, okay, you gave me these 3 milestones, I want to change them to these 3 others, but I'm going to go and implement it so that a lot of the cash can be freed up and used. There is budgetary authority to do things at the university that administrators traditionally, because there's a new president, so I'm not talking about her time, but traditionally just haven't been implemented. And that is the same thing in terms of the federal funds for reconstruction. It has been 8 years and they haven't been implemented. So to me, this is the term of implementation, because if not, people will lose all the hope.
Mr. Secretary, Dave, thank you very much. This great panel, I appreciate it, and to you guys as well. So I apologize for taking up so much time in that last panel, Laura. I'm putting you up here late, so I'll just do a very quick introduction with the 3 things that I think are more important to me about Laura. Her actual bio you guys have access to, but number 1, Laura was at the Yale Law School here, so she's a part of our team. This is not her first rodeo in New Haven. 2, she is the co-founder of this incredible institution, which I really admire and which I think is going to become a model for more enterprises across the U.S. as things modernize. And I think you guys are really kind of at the cutting edge of what working in the civic sector is about. And then lastly, Laura is a friend to Puerto Rico. She is a part of Puerto Rico. She has been a friend to Puerto Rico for a long time. And so we really appreciate your support and the fact that you flew up here to do this for us. So thank you and welcome.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Mike. Thank you, Rosanna. It's really a pleasure to be here. I am keenly aware of the fact that I am the roadblock between you and a weekend, so I will do my level best. I usually come to any speaking engagement with a bag of chocolate to throw at the audience in the event somebody falls asleep, and I don't have it, so I apologize for that. But, very grateful to be here. I was born in Puerto Rico in 1973, a year before the Tobin Committee was formed. I asked my sister, who was born in 1971, the other day, what is your earliest political memory? I was curious, because those 2 years are really important in a child's development. And she said, my earliest political memory was Rafael Hernández Colón's campaign. And there was this parade that went down Winston Churchill Avenue, which is where we lived, and I remember standing there holding a flag. That was her. That was her earliest political memory, and I think it's it's really remarkable because that is the essence of what we're talking about. This young, idealistic, technocratic, untested governor who had these thoughtful ideas and who was bold enough to seek them in a really, really difficult time. Wearing my philanthropist hat, and as I've really enjoyed all the conversations that we've been a part of today about the legacy of the Tobin Report and the difficult messages of the Tobin Report, as a philanthropist, what strikes me the most about the story of the Tobin Report and its aftermath is that it represents exactly what we do every single day at Arnold Ventures. Like the Tobin Center and like the Tobin Report, we at AV and we at the Tobin Center, we at CNE, we're all in the business of saying the hard thing. The thing that takes courage to say because nobody wants to hear it. And you especially know that Republicans and Democrats, any politician, they just don't want to run on it, right? What did the Tobin Report say? We know it well by now, right? It's not whether we should do these things, it's that we should do these things, and the only thing that will be dispositive is if we do the right thing at the right time. Hernández Colón believed that, and what happened to him? He lost. We know that, although I will say that Mike highlighted to me this afternoon the fact that it is quite a tradition in Puerto Rico for governors to only serve one term and to lose the second term. So maybe it wasn't because of this hard decision. Maybe it was because of something else. But what is true is that Hernández Colón didn't have the political cover or the established institutions to stand behind the difficult message that he was delivering. So we've been there. At AV, Tobin Center's been there. CNE has been there. Anybody who does this work has been there, delivering a hard message that falls flat because there isn't the political will to do the hard thing. We need not look very far into the past here in this country to know that. Anybody who's had any interaction with the One Big Beautiful Bill, whatever your political leanings has been, any think tank that has reputable economists had a view, a very specific view with respect to the consequences of extending tax cuts without some sort of of measuring impact. And all of those arguments, of course, were trumped by politics. So this is something that's very, very familiar. Many of us in this room have very fresh battle wounds from exercises just like this one. But having endured the clash between rationality and politics and having been on both the winning and the losing side of a lot of these policy debates, I feel like I've learned a lot at AV, at Arnold Ventures, and that's what I want to talk to you about today. I want to share with you what gives me hope that these kinds of exercises of saying the hard thing are actually not futile, that they can be successful. So I want to share with you what I think my role is as a philanthropist in bolstering and amplifying the outstanding work that, that a lot of you all do in this room, and that the CNE does, that Tobin Center does. And I'll reduce my comments and observations into two principles. The first is that in this context of saying the hard thing, advocacy is just about everything. Advocacy matters. Policy discussions that are informed by the political realities and political pressures really, really matters. Advocacy really matters. And second, culture, within and outside of government, like the Secretary was talking about, matters a lot. So these two lanes, advocacy and culture, are the essence of what we do at Arnold Ventures. So advocacy matters, especially when the issues that you work on and the message that you're conveying aren't popular, but are essential. So I'm going to give you an example from one of our earliest lines of work, which we've been engaging in for over 20 years, which is pension reform. So a pension crisis, to all you economists in the room, I need not explain to you, that is the most frustratingly simple thing to explain, right? Because it is a math problem. You have assets of A, you're poised to owe 10 times A. That is a problem because that delta is going to compound. That's it. That is the definition of a pension crisis. You know, you owe or are positioned to or likely to owe more than you have. That is not sustainable. At some point, the piggy bank will break and people will suffer. That's it. Super simple issue to define, and incredibly frustratingly difficult issue to reform. Now, the reforms are actually pretty easy to define as well, right? So you can define the problem, and you can actually say, what is the solution? Well, the solution is stop the bleeding, stop the abuse, pay only for what you owe, figure out a way back to fiscal responsibility and sustainability. This is not any economist in this room could solve, on paper, the pension crisis in 6 seconds, right? The problem is that even though the solutions are very easy to articulate, they're incredibly risky to pass. Because on the other side, you get opposition that looks like this. Now, I don't know how do I play my thing? Oh yeah, let me see. Let me see if I can tap on my thing. Oh no. Well, let's just, okay. Well, in any event. So assume that this is a firefighter. This is a firefighter who is voicing opposition to pension reforms in his, in Arizona in this case. And essentially their argument is a very sympathetic argument. It says, I help you. Whenever you need me, I am there. Whenever you need a public servant, those public servants show up. Why are you hurting us? So it's and that could be a firefighter, it could be a police officer, it could be a teacher, right? When you deal with public pensions, these are the constituencies that are on the other side of your reform efforts. Because rightly, they say to you, I don't care what your macro issue is, but I was promised this. And you, government, should keep your promises to me. And so it's very hard as a technocrat to say, well, the honest answer is that you should never have been made that promise. That the person who made that promise to you, the politician who made that promise to you, was irresponsible because he or she was making a promise that was politically expedient for her or for him. And that person was sacrificing not only your future, but the future of the entire community. That does not reduce well into a 10-second soundbite. And so very, very frequently, you lose that fight. But you don't have to lose the fight, because sometimes you find courageous actors who want to do the right thing. So again, with the example of pension reform, a very successful example, Rhode Island. Terrible data in terms of pension liability. They were tracking to spend an enormous percentage of their assets on that they did not have on pensions. And it was pretty clear that this wasn't sustainable. So what did we do? And not just we, the collective we, the think tank we, the advocacy we, the entire community who defined this as an issue that was worth pursuing. We found a champion, Governor, then State Treasurer, Gina Raimondo, who cared about this issue very, very deeply. And she had the courage to stand on this issue and run on this issue. We commissioned research. To add transparency and inject transparency into the conversation to really define what was the magnitude of the problem, what was the scope of the irresponsibility that it would be to not address this issue. We had lots and lots and lots. If I could play you that video, it would be very, very angry people who were not in favor of reforming a pension system, of curtailing benefits that were already promised to them. But in the end, not only did we pass pension reform in Rhode Island, Gina Raimondo, in a heavily blue state, with the unions against her, became governor of Rhode Island, and a very, very successful one at that. Yale Law School graduate, by the way, as some of you might know. She may have even gone to Yale undergrad, I'm not sure. But. And I'll give you another quick example that's entirely different, of combining evidence, courage, and advocacy in delivering a hard message. Not sure how much you all know about something not economics in nature, bail reform. No criminal justice issue in recent memory has been more controversial than bail reform. We've been working at Arnold Ventures on bail reform for close to 20 years. We've been funding research and policy, and the evidence is incredibly clear on this point. A system that allows wealth to dictate freedom pre-trial does not make us safer and is extraordinarily expensive. All we should care about at the pre-trial level is risk. We want to keep violent people in jails before they're tried, and we want to release nonviolent, poor people who simply can't make bail but who are not a threat to society. What are the optics of taking that position? You can guess, right? Absolutely terrible, super risky. To many politicians, it does not matter what the data says. It is tantamount to political suicide to go into a public sphere and advocate to release people who are incarcerated. Except for Chris Christie, who saw that in New Jersey, 4 in 10 pool people were granted bail but couldn't afford it. And 73% of all inmates that were confined to a county jail were held pretrial, a significant portion of them being nonviolent. So he did the hard thing, right? A prosecutor by training, a hard-on-crime Republican, said, I'm taking on this issue because it's a fairness issue. And I had a little video of him too, but I can't play that, but that's okay. You can imagine that what he said was, this makes no sense to me. It makes no sense to me as a governor. It makes no sense to me as a US citizen. It makes no sense to me as a public servant who is tasked with safeguarding government resources. Fixed bail systems are an idiotic idea, no matter how you look at it. And I, Republican, am taking this on. So we supported, and we provided a significant amount of scaffolding and research and advocacy support to allow bail reform to happen in New Jersey. You can only imagine the backlash that we got in New Jersey. Everybody from Dog the Bounty Hunter to, who by the way, do not underestimate the influence of Dog the Bounty Hunter. I mean, or of the bail movement in general, the bail industry, right? Because this visceral idea of incarcerate bad people is very, very, very hard to push back on, regardless of how much data you have. But we did, and we achieved incredible, incredible gains in New Jersey. So looking past looking past the initial talking points, the growth, the impact that bail reform has had in New Jersey has been tremendous, and we've replicated that success in a number of areas. So this is all to say that I deeply believe, given my experience as a philanthropist, that a transformative idea that's grounded in evidence, that's championed by a courageous leader, and that's bolstered by advocacy resources, absolutely can carry the day. We've seen this time and time and time again. But I also learned that it's not just about exerting pressure from the outside. Again, the secretary talked a little bit about this. Culture matters. We need to instill within government the importance of evidence. And that's also much of what we do at Arnold Ventures. We constantly remind ourselves, as kitschy as it sounds, that things that don't work don't help people. Right? Like, why are we promoting things that don't work? And should we not all care about the fact that about asking the question about whether or not something works? CNE knows that. That's why they're diligently studying and have studied so many policies that impact people's lives in Puerto Rico, tax policy, energy policy, housing. Tobin Center knows that. Its rigorous evaluations generate insights on virtually every aspect of the economy and aspects that affect the lives of everyday Americans. So I believe that my role as a philanthropist is to bolster activities like these. So we embed scholars into government. We were talking about this in the previous panel. We've done that in Connecticut, here in Connecticut with the Tobin Center. We conduct randomized controlled trials on interventions that have demonstrated promise, and we invest in scaling of what we know works. And that not only expands the breadth of our collective knowledge, which is important, but it instills within governments this idea that we have to ask the question. We always have to keep asking the question. Is this working? Is it not working? Does something that works have unintended consequences that we hadn't foreseen, right? That by definition are misaligned with our core intent. It's important to ask these questions and to exercise that muscle. And to keep asking again and again and again, what do we know about what works? And if we flex that muscle and build that muscle, then I believe the government actors, in the end, will be better positioned to make bolder and better decisions. And I do believe that building that culture is possible. Tobin Center does it every day. We try to do it at the federal and state levels. We have a project called Partnership for Proven Programs, where we partner with with governors in different states. We've partnered with Governor Westmore in Maryland, Governor Kevin Stitt in Oklahoma, Governor Jared Polis in Colorado, to do exactly this. And so what we do is we match funding. In some cases it's $20 million, in some cases it's $10 million. Significant amounts, but not needle-moving amounts, right? It's not about the money. It's about the exercise. It's about saying this pot of money is dedicated to identifying programs that are proven to move the needle in an area that is highly relevant to a specific state, and that we as a government are going to prioritize those programs, divert resources from what doesn't work and toward what does work. And the hope is that these seed investments will fuel a change in attitude. And again, if you had seen, if I were able to play things, I would have played Kevin Stitt on the left and Westmore on the right, making that exact point in their own states, in their own words, saying, the reason I care about these things in my state is because things that don't work don't help people. And I want to help people. That's why we're here. So courageous leadership, evidence-based policy proposals, political air cover, targeted advocacy dollars, and a government and civic culture that demands evidence, that's my formula. for how you change. And my sincere hope is that when I have my own debates around my kitchen table about the future of Puerto Rico, or the future of my state, the future of this country, we're able to have those debates in a way that's based on evidence. Not because I don't value the other components of the debate, identity, nationalism, because I do, and not because I don't want to have an emotional debate about how we should feel about being part of the United States or not being part of the United States. I think those debates are important, but because I really do believe that courage begins with facts. Facts like those offered by Professor Tobin 50 years ago, and those offered by the people in this room. And that courage, bolstered by evidence and amplified by the forces of all of us, I do believe will lead to a much brighter future for Puerto Rico. Thank you so much. I so appreciate being here.
Thank you so much. I'm glad that Laura gave the keynote closing, because we did end in an optimistic outlook. This can be done. This can be done. And I think that to bring this to a close, all I want to say, and it's something that the secretary also mentioned, and I say this all the time, if we want a different Puerto Rico, it really is up to us. And so I leave the young, the old, the in-betweens with that charge. It really is up to us. Thank you very much for being here.